Hey, Jordan.
Hey,
Hey, question for you before we get started. Are we 6 weeks or 7 weeks for the class?
right. So it's going to be six meetings. This is our second of six.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. I
Because
mean,
for
yeah.
the business strategies class, Reem shows us going out into May.
I told her not to do that. If that's extra sessions a problem for you and she still has it, then you have every right to not attend. Not that
Well, we're not having class. We're not doing the Zoom classes or anything. It's all online.
oh, she's not teaching at all?
Nope.
So, okay. So,
We had one Zoom last Wednesday for about an hour and a half, and that was it.
okay, interesting. First, I'm hearing of that, and that surprises me. But then, well, okay, never mind that for a second. The first thing you said is no longer matters then, right?
Well, no, because she has assignments out until the first week in May.
Okay, but theoretically, you could get them done earlier.
I mean, you could. There's a case study each week, or what she calls the one-page memo on a different Harvard Business Review case, and then the capstone project. So
Yeah. Well, that project is a big deal, obviously. So
yeah,
the more time you have, the better. But if you want to get it in earlier and be done and start your summer, then well, actually, you probably be taking another class.
I was gonna say if
Never mind that.
that's the only week we have off of the whole summer.
Yeah, just
So
start it now, get it done early.
my proposal is not due for another for like 2 weeks, and I've already done it. So
Yeah, there you go. Uh,
okay.
but I'm gonna check in with her. I thought she would be lecturing on. I don't understand why she's unless she
No,
has.
she's got it set up as a just a regular online class. We have one of the case studies this week. She posted the questions. We have to comment on, each person does a response, and we have to at least 3 comments on other people's responses. And then the other case studies, we just write a one-page memo, and that's it. And then next time we meet is that first week in May is when everybody turns in their capstone project and then gives their presentation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm gonna confer with her. I'll get back to you if there's anything we need to follow up on. But okay.
Okay.
First, I'm hearing. Yeah.
Hey, Laura.
Hey. All right. So let me go to the list here. Probably. Okay, we're batting 500. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of you out of, should be 10 of us total. Got 2 minutes to go. 1 minute. Okay, well, I would ordinarily start right at 6 on the dot. There's a few introductory things I want to say, so I'm going to give the remaining 4 of you who are not here yet a chance to arrive. So we'll give everybody 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes. One, two, 5, 6. All right. 6 out of 10 present. Okay, I think I'm going to get rolling here. So welcome back, everyone. I wanted to just kind of do a little bit of housekeeping, both with regard to the course and Zoom technology. I think there's a few points of order that we want to make here. So I kind of reviewed the way last week went, and I think my overall assessment would be not bad, especially for it's the first time I've ever done a Zoom class. I don't know about you, but the first time for me. So more or less it was pretty smooth, but there's a few things that I observed that I want to tell you about. One is, and I think most of you are doing this, when you come on, you will automatically be muted because that's just the standard practice. And you want to stay muted until there's, you put a hand up or you want to contribute something. That way, if there's a train in the background or, whatever else is going on in your house, we don't all hear it. So we had a few of those instances last time. All you got to do is click on your profile and do unmute, and it's pretty easy to unmute yourself. And then when you're done talking, just remute yourself, and then I'll do the same thing. I may do the same thing when you're talking and I'm not talking. Okay, that's number one. Number two, there is so I think with the hand raising or just kind of speaking up, it seemed to work okay last week. There is, if you don't already know, a hand raise function in your control panel where again, it's different for me versus you, but you click it or you select it and then it'll show like a green box that you're raising your hand. So I think maybe try that today if you want, if you have a question or you want to contribute something. And I might see that quicker than you actually putting your hand up, because first of all, I can only see half of you. That's the first problem. At any given time, I'd have to scroll down to see everybody, or to see the next 5 of you. So if you do the hand thing, that I think is more salient for me. But if that's not catching my attention, then either put your hand up or just scream out and interrupt. It's fine. No hard feelings. Okay, that's number 2. Number 3 thing is, I promised you last week that I would have recordings. I ran into a lot of snags with getting the video produced, but actually I have it now. And what I did with it, I'll just show you. I have to go to this new share now and pull up Moodle. But basically, of course, it'll take me an eternity to, so there's a million windows here that I have to cycle between, but basically it's on Moodle. And I want to show you where, because I put it into yeah. Okay. Why is it not coming up? Are you guys seeing my Moodle? Yes, no?
Yeah, we are.
Okay, cool. So there should be yeah, if you click on announcements, you'll see here's the week 1 video link. So you just click on that and, oh, actually the video is itself in there. I didn't know that. I thought it was just gonna be a link, but there you go. There's the video. Now I didn't edit it because, there's Tina, we won't focus on her. I didn't edit it because I just got it up today. So you're gonna see, the break and the intro and before the intro and everything. So you just fast forward through the parts that you don't care about. And then starting probably next week, I'll start posting videos that are edited. No absolute promise, but I will aim to do that now that I figured out how to post the video. Okay, so those will be in the announcements. I'm not putting them in the formal part of the course because I don't want them to be permanent. Because I'm going to edit them later on if I don't do it in time for posting them. Okay, so that's recordings. Every week will be recorded in case you miss it or you want to go over it again. The last thing I noticed about myself was I was talking too fast. I would, sample different parts of the lecture and I just, wow, too fast. So I made a promise to myself and now to you that I will slow it down this week. I think what happens is when I started getting on this technology, you're managing a million things at a time, and so you tend to speed up, or at least I tend to speed up. So I'll slow it down this week, promise. Okay, I think that's it for me. Any questions from you guys about anything? Anything coming up? Great, okay, well, if they occur to you later, let us know. And what I'm gonna do is start us back with economics, microeconomics. So I'm going to do a new share here of elasticity. And again, like I said, I think I figured out why we were having all those problems last week with the you weren't seeing certain screens of mine. I realized what I have to do now. I literally have to go to the file and share it. So that's the learning for me, as opposed to sharing a screen. Okay, so we're all seeing elasticity, yes? Good, okay. The thumbs up is a great thing. Okay, let's do the thumbs up. So here we go. Now this picks up nicely from our last topic, which was supply and demand. And you'll see it's basically an extension of demand itself. But you all have rubber bands somewhere in your house probably, and you know that there's some rubber bands that are, very hard to move. They're not elastic, or we're going to call it inelastic. And then there are other rubber bands that you pull it a little bit and it goes like out to outer space, right? So you understand the concept of elasticity from a rubber band perspective, and now we're going to talk about it from an economic perspective. And really what we mean by elasticity, which is short for the longer term, which is elasticity of demand, is how much demand is going to move when some other factor related to demand also moves. Okay, and so really, you're seeing how much demand is changing based on something else happening in the environment. And the most common factor that we look at is price, right? The demand curve, the law of demand says higher demand at lower price. But the question is, when we start changing price, how much exactly does demand change? And if you're a marketer or you are an economist, who the heck wouldn't want to know that? Okay, if we're going to change price, how much demand is going to change by, because it affects our whole business cycle. So we need to know how to study this and how to use it. And the most common elasticity of demand is called price elasticity of demand. That's the first bullet point there in the second bullet point set. How much does demand change relative to price? Now, we can look at, again, demand changing relative to any other factor that makes sense. So income, right? What happens when incomes go up? Does demand go up, and by how much? Or down? It could even go down. Prices of other goods. We're going to talk about cross-price elasticity. And then if you're an economist or a marketer, you study all different kinds of elasticities. We could talk about elasticity based on the weather. You're not going to see that in your textbook, but that's a possibility. So I'm just saying it's a very broad concept. We're going to look at 3 different kinds, okay? And my bottom bullet point there is the big warning. What type of elasticity are we talking about? You have to specify. So we will always specify. Okay, so here we go. Starting off with price elasticity of demand. How much demand changes when price changes? Very simple concept shown by the demand curve itself. And then it turns out there's actually tons of formulas. So I wrote there in bullet 2, lots of formulas. But we're just going to look at 2 here to keep things simple. Understand that when you do this, when you might do a web search, you might consult another text, you might run into this at work, and you're going to see another formula not shown here being used, and that's because there are lots and lots of elasticity formulas, and the one you use depends on what your boss tells you to do, what the precedent is, what data you have, et cetera, et cetera. But all formulas revolve around 2 simple terms, which is changes in quantity and changes in price. So that's your first one here. This is Greek E, epsilon, which is price elasticity of demand, or just elasticity, equals, what are these big lines here, vertical lines? Absolute value. Absolute value just means take the quantity. If it's negative, make it positive. If it's already positive, keep it positive, okay? Because we always like to talk in terms of positive numbers. And that's it. In the numerator, you have percentage change in quantity demanded. In the denominator, you have percentage change in price. Now, why is it percentage change? Because that standardizes all of the different elasticities we could possibly calculate. Just think about it. Prices are very different for different things. Think about the price of a house, which in the Bay Area would be maybe $1 million if you're lucky. That would be a shack. Versus the price of a pack of gum, which is, I don't know, $1, okay? You're looking at differences in those prices, and if you just look at the actual numbers, you're going to get way different results for elasticity when sometimes those elasticities are actually fairly similar. So the way we get around that is everything becomes a percentage change. You don't work in dollar figures, you work in percentage changes in both quantity and price. Okay, so that's the first formula. This one we're going to come back to in a second. So hold that thought. Let's move on. Let's do a quick, simple example with numbers. We're going to talk about hamburgers tonight, which I'm eating more of because it seems to be like the only option available with takeout, drive-through. But okay, hamburgers. We're going to tell you that we have data that say prices rise from $5 to $6 for a burger, and then when that happens, the quantity demanded falls from 10 to 7. Okay, now you're looking at these numbers and you're saying that's ridiculous. 10 to 7. Why would anybody do a study with 10 burgers? You would want to study millions of burgers. Yeah, we're just keeping it simple so that you understand the concepts. These numbers are just instructive. Okay, so the first thing I do is I figure out what's the percentage change in quantity demanded. So the rule is you always take the new minus the old over the old. In this case, it's quantities. And that gives you your answer. Here it's minus 30% change, okay? Look at the change in price, same rule, new minus old over the old gives the percentage change of 20%. Okay, now you notice something, this guy is negative and this guy is positive. That should almost always be the case, almost always. I say almost because there are some exceptions when we start talking about inferior goods. When we start talking about, let me get back to the exception later. I'm giving you the wrong terminology, but regardless, most of the time you're going to get this number negative, this number positive, and it doesn't even matter because what you then do is take the two numbers, put them inside the absolute value brackets, and then whatever you have in here becomes positive anyway, so it's 1.5. Okay, and that is your price elasticity of demand for hamburgers, 1.5. So what the heck does that mean? Basically, 1.5 is saying that your quantity demanded changes 1.5 times as fast as your price changes. Okay, so we're going to come back to that thought in a slide or two when we compare it to a different number. So hold that thought for a second. Now, I said a slide or two ago that we have this other formula for elasticity. This is called point elasticity. And the difference between this elasticity, obviously the formula is different, slightly different. But conceptually how it's different is we are figuring out the elasticity of demand for price at a specific point on the demand curve, okay? So let me actually skip ahead a slide and you'll see what I mean. Okay, so this is your demand curve. Remember last week we talked a lot about demand curves and we said, price on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis, and then the curve is sloped downward because it reflects the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. That is to say, as you increase price higher and higher, what happens to quantity demanded? It goes down, 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 down. Okay, that's the law of demand represented by the demand curve. So coming back to the point elasticity formula here, what's going on? Well, you can see if I go to different sections of the demand curve and I look at the elasticities being calculated using this formula here, they're different numbers. Here the elasticity is 5, here it's 2, here it's 1. Okay, and so what you see is as we go down in price, because if you're going down the curve, you're going lower and lower on the y-axis. As we go down in price, elasticity drops. Okay, and so why does that happen? Well, think about an elasticity of 5. What that's saying is that demand is changing 5 times as fast as price. So that's a huge elasticity. That's a big rubber band stretch. Demand stretches a lot, okay? So when we raise price just a little bit, demand is going to fall a lot at an elasticity of 5. But if we go to the opposite end of the spectrum where elasticity is low, 0.2, then what we're saying is that the quantity demanded changes 0.2 times the amount of price decrease. Or so in other words, if your price went up $1, then your demand only decreased by 20%. Okay, I'm sorry, if your price went up 1%, then your demand only went down by 0.2 times that 1%, or 0.2%. So anyway, put aside the numbers. What we're saying here is that the rubber band doesn't stretch at all at E equals 0.2. It stretches slightly, which means that you can move price up or down and demand's basically going to stay the same. It's going to move a little bit. So it's what we call inelastic demand. But why is it that the E is high here and it's low here and then it just falls in between? And the answer is because think about what happens when you have lower prices. When you have lower prices, moving the price a little bit doesn't change your demand. You want to buy a lot, okay? All else equal. When prices are dropping, what do? You stock up, okay? When prices are high, like up around here, then your elasticity goes up because you're saying to yourself, I'm already paying a lot for each of these things, whatever these things are. So if you're going to raise price on me even more, I'm out of the market, or I'm really going to severely cut back the amount that I buy. So elasticity on a demand curve is not a constant thing. It actually changes as you move up and down the demand curve, which is really representing an up and down movement for price. Okay, so the upshot of all this is this formula is going to tell you what the elasticity is at any given point on the demand curve. It could be here, it could be here, it could be here, it could be in between these 2 points. We just happen to identify a few points here to be instructive, but I can do a point elasticity anywhere on this curve. And it's going to go down as I go down the curve. It's going to go up as I go up the curve. So what you do is you take your normal quantity of demand change, your normal price of demand change, which is actually in this case in number terms, not percentage terms. And then you actually identify the Q sub D and the P are representing where you are in that demand curve. So for instance, let's say I was here at point A, your quantity would be 20 and your price would also be 20. That's coincidental that they're the same number. So let's talk about point B. Your quantity would be 40 and your price would be 10. And that's what you would plug in for this number and this number, in addition to figuring out the delta Q and the delta P, okay? Or another way to calculate this point elasticity is this simplified expression here, which still makes use of the P and the QD that I just talked about, but also throws in this B term, which replaces the delta Q over the delta P. This B is the slope term of this demand curve, okay, inverted, because the slope is change in Y over change in X, but in economics, we look at change in X over change in Y. We basically flip the axes. So you would calculate a slope on this curve, you would take that number and put it under 1, and that would result in the B that you're seeing here, okay? So I define that down here. Take 1 over the slope of the demand curve, and that's your B. And then you plug the B in. So it'll get you the same answer as this, okay? And so just realize there are 2 ways to skin the cat here. Okay, so that's point elasticity, different from, again, our initial formula, which is a little simpler, but this is talking about elasticity over the whole demand curve, which is really kind of incorrect, if you will, okay? Because as we just said, elasticities change across the demand curve. Now, I want to just tell you one other interesting tidbit here. I'm going to go to my whiteboard for a second. And if I draw, that is terrible. Let's undo that. Okay. Draw a good line and a good line. And if I draw a demand curve that looks like this, see how it's curved? This is what we call a unitary elasticity demand curve. So every point on this demand curve, here, 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 everything, has the same elasticity, okay? Because the curve is actually literally a curve. But when you have the straight line demand curve like we've been looking at, then the elasticity here is unequal to here, unequal to here, unequal to here. It's only equal if you have this curve. When would you have this curve? This is actually more representative of reality, believe it or not. But textbooks and most economists, just to keep things simple, they will usually just draw a straight line. But this is actually a bit more realistic for some products, not every product, and it depends also on the pricing ranges that you're dealing with. Okay, so that's just a quick tidbit. Let's get back to the meat of the matter. Okay, back to elasticity. In elasticity, now we're going to talk about literally defining elastic versus inelastic demand. But conceptually, again, the way I want you to think about it is, if demand is elastic, think about the elastic rubber band that you're pulling out forever. That's demand. Demand is changing a lot when you change price. Okay, whether it's, what's the normal relationship? You raise price, demand goes down. You lower price, demand goes up. So I don't know what direction it's changing until you tell me what direction price is changing. But the point is, whether you raise price or lower price, the smallest little change in price is going to have a big effect on demand. And that's what we call elastic demand. Okay, and literally, if you go down to the bottom here, mathematically, the number is going to be higher than 1. So if you see an elasticity greater than 1, you have elastic demand. The higher that number goes, the more elastic the demand you have. So if I have an elasticity of 10, that's a higher elasticity than an elasticity of 4. 20 is even higher. 30, it can go to infinity theoretically, but typically it doesn't go that high. Okay. The opposite end of the spectrum is inelastic demand, where your ratio that you calculate is less than 1. And again, what's the numeric range for elasticity? Most of the time, it's 0 to infinity. You don't have negative numbers unless it's a special case. So with inelastic demand, you're basically talking about a fractional elasticity coefficient, something between 0 and 1. Okay. Now, again, what does that mean conceptually? I'm changing price. Maybe I nudge it up. I can nudge it up a lot or nudge it down a lot. Demand is not changing. It just isn't. Okay, because that's the nature of the product. We're going to determine, what kinds of things are elastic versus inelastic in a second. But that's conceptually what we have. Demand not responding to price changes. And then the third case, which you almost never get, it's a theoretical kind of a thing, more so than an actual, is elasticity of 1 exactly, which means that you have price changing as much as demand changing. Okay, so you see in the right here, quantity demanded changed equals the amount of price change. Do you ever get that number? No, but you still have to include it in the realm of possibilities because it's theoretically possible. And sometimes you'll get a number like 1.1. Okay, and so technically it's elastic, but conceptually and figuratively, it's really more acting like a unitary elastic demand than it is elastic demand. Okay, so numbers close to 1, usually most economists will wind up calling them unit or unitary elastic demand. All right, moving on. Let's revisit some examples so we can illustrate this with numbers. Okay, so this is the hamburger example we looked at a few minutes ago. Nothing new here. But remember, we changed the price from $5 to $6, and hamburgers demanded fell from 10 to 7. And we calculated an elasticity coefficient of 1.5, which by our former slide definition would be elastic, though not highly elastic. And now we're going to change up. Everything you see here in red is the changes. So now we still keep the price change the same, but the quantity of hamburgers demanded goes from 10 to 4 when we raise the price, not 10 to 7 anymore. So I'm going to plug the 4 in here, which gets us to a 60% decrease in quantity. The price increase is still the same. So I take that negative 60, drop it in here. Our new elasticity in red here is 3, which was higher than the 1.5 we had before. So these hamburgers, for whatever reason, have a higher elasticity than the other hamburgers. Okay, and it's conveyed by that 3 being higher than 1.5. Pretty simple. All right, so it's the higher the number, the more the elasticity, basically. And remember, again, everything is positive numbers because we have that absolute value sign that makes us convert to positive. All right. Now, two theoretical extreme cases of elasticity that you almost never see in real life, but you come close to seeing, so we have to just define them for the sake of completeness. The first case is perfectly elastic demand, or, as I write here, the elasticity is infinite. Okay, remember, because we went from 1 to 3, then we could have gone to 10, 20, all the way to infinity. Okay, what that means is that the tiniest little change in price creates an infinite change in demand, whether it's up or down. Okay, and what do I do with that? Nothing. I mean, again, this never happens in real life. It's just an end case that you talk about, because sometimes the markets start to act that way towards that end point, but they never actually get there. Okay, but look at the curve. If this is the demand curve, you never saw a horizontal demand curve. Now you're seeing one, and what we're saying here is that the littlest change in price, you know, if this went from $1, which is the price, to like $1.01, then you would go from say 100 to like 800, 900, 1,000, really technically infinity, but we can't show that. Okay, so that's what a horizontal demand curve is saying, is that a tiny nudge in price creates an infinite increase in demand. The other case is the vertical demand curve, where I can go up and down with price all day long, but the quantity remains at 4. Okay, so that's perfectly inelastic demand. The demand is not changing based on any price change, and that's vertical. Or in other words, you could say elasticity is 0 as opposed to infinite. Again, you're almost never gonna see this. Yeah, but well, so let's use a current example that's starting to approximate this, just so you can appreciate. Face masks, which everybody wants and nobody can get. You know, pretty much any price you're trying to charge in certain circumstances, hospitals are going to pay. Now there's a limit. You know, at some point you say, forget it, can't do it. We don't have the budget. We literally don't have the money, and you're ripping us off. There's a moral issue there. But when you really need this stuff, and maybe you could even talk it in terms of the ventilators that nobody seems to have either, it starts to approach a perfectly inelastic kind of a situation where you'll pay any price. Okay, because the opposite is elastic or perfectly elastic, where if you don't charge me the price that I like, I don't buy nothing from you. Done. Goodbye. See you later. Okay, so we're going to talk about some more examples of these two extreme cases, but it's never this extreme because other things start to kick in, right? Okay, so speaking of the devil, here we are. What determines how elastic a good is? And the number one thing is the number of close substitutes. Okay, remember from last week, a substitute is something that you buy in place of something else when the price rises, right? So we talked about chicken and beef. The price of chicken's going up, so what do? We buy beef instead because they're both a protein. You know, what's going on with the mass now? The price is getting too high and we don't have enough, so we just make our own, basically. It's cheaper and it's more efficient. But you understand the idea of substitute. So what are my examples here? Buying motor oil. You go to buy motor oil for your car. You got like, I don't know, 20, 30 choices, right? Go to Walmart, wherever you go, car store. There are too many substitutes. So what tends to happen for prices with motor oil is they tend to be, or demand for motor oil rather, is elastic. Contrast that with demand for, well, I kind of already got into medical examples, but you know, you're on the operation table and you're about to die. Horrible thing to say, especially in this day and age. But what are you going to do? You're going to argue with the doctor about the price of the operation? No, whatever he wants to do. If he wants to take your life savings, you're going to, you know, let him do it. But of course, you're not going to get into this conversation while you're sick and dying. But the point is, you know, anything medical that's saving your life or very important to your health, the elasticity is pretty close to 0. Okay, it's the opposite end of the spectrum. It's not exactly 0, but it's pretty close to 0. But certainly it's much more inelastic than buying motor oil. So that's number one. Most of the time, that's going to determine 90% of the elasticity of a product, is the close substitutes. The second one is fraction of budget, less important, but still important in some cases. So, you know, when you're buying a home, that's a big purchase. When you're buying a phone, it's not a tiny purchase nowadays, but, you know, buying a phone at most nowadays is about $1,000. A home is $500,000, whatever you're spending. So obviously, big difference. When I'm buying the home, that buy is more elastic than buying the phone. And then buying the pack of gum is even more elastic than buying either of those two, because that's a dollar transaction. Okay, so the percentage of your budget you spend on whatever is going to determine elasticity. Okay, now here's, and it's good that Serena brought this up last week. She was talking about an example with oil, and she made the comment about, what happens when we lower prices? We should sell more stuff, right, if we're a business. And the answer is not necessarily. It depends on how elastic the product is, the price elasticity of demand for the good that we're talking about. So now you know the three ends of the spectrum, so to speak. You've got elastic, inelastic, and unitary elastic demand. But furthermore, you know how to map this to numbers. We can calculate the coefficient, and if it's a 2, we know it's basically elastic. If it's a 0.3, we know it's basically inelastic. If it's a 1 or near 1, it's unitary. So then we can look at these rules and see what's going to happen. Okay, so for elastic demand, when I increase price, I'm going to talk about everything in terms of an increase in price. But when I increase price for elastic demand goods, total revenue goes down. Okay, because again, if it's elastic demand, what do people do? You raise the price on me, I ain't buying. I'm not buying at all, or I'm going to buy much, much less than you probably want me to. So the companies get stuck with the inventory. Okay, again, goods with a lot of substitutes, you start raising price on those when there's all this competition, your revenue goes down pretty quickly because the demand is elastic. Opposite end of the spectrum, inelastic demand, coefficient of between 0 and 1. If I increase price, price increase, what did I write there? Price increases cause a small decrease in the quantity demanded, right? So the end point of all that is I raise price, because I said I'm going to talk about everything in terms of price increases, and total revenue now goes up. Okay, even though there's a decrease in quantity demanded, you're always going to have a decrease in quantity demanded, whether the good is elastic or inelastic or unitary. But what we're focusing on here is what happens to total revenue. Okay, so which then of course feeds into the company's profitability. So inelastic demand goods, we increase the price, total revenue goes up. So if you have that, why wouldn't you just raise price? Of course you would. And then you say, why don't I raise price to infinity, some really high number? Well, because at a certain point, you can't keep doing that. At a certain point, if you raise price too much, people just stop buying. Okay, just like they did with they were selling the masks in Mexico for, I think, like $9 a mask, right? And so nobody bought them because we'll find other ways. We'll make our own, we'll buy from a cheaper supplier, but you can raise it to a certain extent and then people stop. Another quick example on that was gas prices. Okay, gas prices, they can be elastic, they can be inelastic. I'm sorry, the demand for gas can be elastic or inelastic. What they found was you could keep raising the price of gas to about $6.50 and people wouldn't cut back. And why is that? Because how are you going to get to work if you can't take public transportation, right? If you rely on your car to drive to work, you're shit out of luck. You still got to buy gas. Okay, but once you raise the price to a certain point, then people start finding other ways to get to work. Okay, well, I guess calling Uber wouldn't help. And this was back before the days of Uber, even when we had, gas prices were getting towards about $6. I think we had a high of about $5.50 in the Bay Area. But they did a study and it said once you hit $6.50 or so, then people start making a lot of drastic changes to their driving habits. Okay, so just because you have inelastic demand doesn't mean you can always raise price to some really, really high level, but you can still do price increases within a certain range. And so you would be stupid as a business, all else equal. Again, there's a moral issue, and there's just, being a decent human being and not price gouging, right? You can't, in the state of California, when there's an emergency like we have now, you can't raise price beyond a certain level anyway because the law forbids you. But throw all that away and say you can, have your own discretion. You would only raise price a certain range anyway, because after a certain range, it gives out. Okay. last point here, if we have unit elastic demand, it's kind of a wash. Revenue doesn't change because you're at unitary elasticity. Okay, so understand the different revenue dynamics when we look at these price increases for the three cases. If we're talking about price decreases, just reverse everything. So in other words, price decrease would lead to increase here. It would lead to decrease here. And then it still wouldn't change under this situation. So just the flip side logic applies when we're talking about price decreases. Okay, we have now graduated price elasticity of demand. From price elasticity of demand, we're moving on to income elasticity of demand, which is our second elasticity factor. Remember, I said there's millions of them, but we're only going to look at a few. The second of which is income. And the formula, it looks very similar to the first one, right? You see a percentage change in the numerator, a percentage change in the denominator. You notice the subscript here, inc, which means income. But we're again looking at how much does demand change when we have a change in income. And we put it all in percentage terms. Now, you would automatically think that, if income goes up, demand is going to go up, but it's not true. Because we have two kinds of goods in this world. We have normal goods and we have inferior goods. And so normal goods are probably about 90% of what we consume. Okay, it's the vast majority. And normal goods, when income goes up, then consumption increases of those goods. So think about, you get a raise. Now I'm going to Hawaii this year, okay? Or I made some money in the stock market, I'm going to Hawaii. Or I'm going to consume that expensive bottle of wine that I always wanted to consume, but I didn't really want to spend on it until I had more money. But so what's happening? Income's going up and the demand for these goods is going up at the same time, normal goods. Inferior goods goes the opposite direction. When income goes up, you demand less of them. So perfect example here is fast food, of which I've been eating a lot lately, not because my income is changing, but because it's the only thing available. But the general public tends to eat less fast food the more money they make, right? Most people, fast food, we all eat fast food, but the extent to which you eat it is going to depend largely on your income. And the more income you have, the less fast food you consume. And then if you ever shopped at Trader Joe's, you might know about $2 chuck wine, which is wine that sells for $2, which, by the way, nobody can taste the difference when you cook with it. So you should be buying that and cooking with it instead of spending on a $40 bottle of wine and cooking with it. There's no difference in taste. But that aside, what do? When you're making more money, you don't want to buy the inexpensive wines. You want to buy the more expensive wines. So the demand for the inexpensive wines goes down the more money you make. Okay, and that's what's called an inferior good. So what happens mathematically to the elasticity coefficient is what you see here. It's positive for normal goods. It's negative for inferior goods. And let's look at a mathematical example right away. So we're going to use the same ideas here. Demand for Hawaiian vacations goes up 200%. We're just going to convert everything to percentages now, just to make your life easy. When incomes increase 50%, so just put those two numbers in a ratio. 200 over 50 is a 4, and it's a positive 4, which is an indication that you've got a normal good. Okay. Let's go to the cheap wine example. $2 chuck, which incidentally now retails for like $3, I think. So we have to change the nickname. But $2 chuck wine demand falls 40% when incomes increase 20% here at the right. So we do the ratio now. Notice the top is negative and the bottom is positive. And we don't take an absolute value because we want to preserve the sign of the ratio in this elasticity case. So we see the answer is -2.0, and the fact that it's negative tells us we're dealing with an inferior good. Okay, now which one is more elastic? This one is in the absolute sense because you're jumping 4, and here you're jumping 2 times the amount of change in income, basically. But we're not even talking about price anymore. Okay, so higher elasticity here, but these are different elasticities because this is negative and this is positive, which means we have, again, normal good versus inferior good. Okay, so that's income elasticity. Now we move on to the last type we'll look at, which is called cross price. Again, it's always elasticity of demand. So our numerator is always percentage change in demand. Now the denominator changes to percentage change in the price of a related good. So what the heck do I mean by a related good? Well, products get sold together sometimes, or it could be that the products' demands are related through their different prices. Okay, so let's look at the example to clarify. Milk and cookies, one of my favorites. People, not everybody, but some people, a lot of people consume milk and cookies together. It's not milk separately from cookies, it's milk and cookies together. So those goods, if I jump down to the bottom here of the slide, are complementary because they're consumed as a package, basically. Okay, so what happens is when you start messing with the price of one, the demand for the other goes down or up. It changes according to the price change in the complementary good. So let's look at the example again. The price of cookies rises from $5 to $6. So price of cookies going up. The quantity of milk demanded goes down from 10 to 7. Whatever, it could be crates or it could be bottles, whatever, it doesn't matter. Okay, and why does that happen? Again, because you're making cookies more expensive. Cookies are consumed with milk. So now that cookies are more expensive, I don't really want to eat cookies and milk or consume cookies and milk as much as I used to because they come as a package. So the demand for milk goes down, as does the demand for cookies, just based on the law of demand. If cookies price goes up, then the demand for cookies goes down. So what do? I calculate the percentage change in the quantity of milk demanded. So the other thing you have to understand with these calculations and cross prices, which good are you looking at the elasticity of? Here it's the elasticity for milk. We could do another calculation with the elasticity for cookies, but that's not in the cards here. We're looking at the change in quantity of milk demanded relative to change in price of cookies. Okay, so milk, old minus new over old. Sorry, I got that wrong. Old minus new, new minus old over old. That's what I meant to say. Minus 30% change in quantity of milk demanded, and then the cookie price change is 6 minus 5 over 5, 20%. Put them in a fraction. Again, no absolute value. Forget it, because we want to know the sign, and the answer is negative 1.5. So when you see a negative cross-price elasticity, that means that the goods are complementary. That is just a fact of life in these calculations, okay? Now we're going to look at the opposite situation where you have substitutes. Goods are either not related. There's 3 cases. Not related, like car tires and calendars. There's no relationship between the two. They are complementary, like milk and cookies, or they are substitutes like beef and chicken, like we've been talking all along. Okay, so let's look at the cross-price elasticity here. The price of beef is rising from $5 to $6 a pound. The quantity of chicken demanded rises from 20 to 30 cases, right? That makes sense. Price of beef going up, what do? I substitute chicken because they're both proteins. So I would expect the demand for chicken to go up. So let's figure out the percent increase in chicken demand, 30 minus 20 over 20, new minus old over old, 50% increase. And the price change in beef is also positive, 6 minus 5 over 5, new minus old over old, 20% increase. I drop the 2 numbers into a ratio, and it's 2.5, positive, okay? When I have a positive number, that means, for cross-price elasticity, that means goods are substitutes, which is what we say down here. Now, if I compare this 2.5 back to the 1.5 here, forget the sign, the elasticity is higher here. So there's, again, more change coming about in the quantity, in this case, of chicken demanded when there's a change in price of beef than when we have an analogous situation here with the price of cookies, okay? So yes, there are different, the positive and negative signs, but if you want to look at the magnitude of the change, you just forget the sign and compare the numbers, take absolute values. That gives you the magnitude of the change. So here we have it summarized. substitute goods like the chicken and beef, the cross price elasticity is always positive. I don't know what number it's going to be, but that's what you calculate it for, and then it'll guaranteed be positive. And then the rule is, and this could twist your mind a lot when you try to read this, but the things that are in parentheses go together, the ones that are not in parentheses go together. Consumption of good X increases when the price of good Y increases, right? So that was our chicken beef example. Beef went up in price, so we bought more chicken, and those were substitutes. And then complementary goods, milk and cookies, we consume less milk when the price of cookies goes up, okay? Or you could say we consume more cookies when the price of milk goes down, is another way to think about it. But whatever way you want to think about it, the mathematics of it are that the cross price elasticity is negative. It's going to be a negative number less than 0 for complementary goods. Okay. Now, last thing here on the elasticity topic is I want to come back to something that you've already seen. We started talking a lot about functional notations last week and actually kind of fleshing out functions in equation form. And we showed you this very slide. And what we were figuring out here is the quantity demanded of genes was a function of the price of those genes, the price of a substitute, skirts, because you can choose between skirts and genes theoretically. And then it's also a function of how much money you make, right? You're going to typically, if we consider this to be a normal good, you're going to buy more genes when you have higher income. And then what we did is we took that functional notation and we fleshed it out into this equation. And we told you that you would gather data, you go out into the market and see what the quantities demanded were. You would see what prices were, prices of skirts and income levels. And you would start to fill in the B and the C and the D and the A. And the way you do that is through regression. And we're going to do that later on in the course under the statistics module. But what are you trying to do? You're trying to put together a prediction model of how people are going to act when these things change, these prices change, which every marketer wants to have. Okay, that's the holy grail of marketing, is predicting the future. So really what you were doing here was figuring out B, which was the price elasticity of demand for genes. You were figuring out C, which is the cross price elasticity coefficient for skirts, okay, which would be, let's remember what it would be. Since skirts are a substitute, it's going to be a positive number here because that's the way it fleshes out according to our rules. And then income, if it's a normal good, you would get, your D would be an elasticity coefficient for income, which should also be positive. That is to say, as income goes up, so will quantity demanded. So therefore, this number D goes up because we consider genes to be a normal good. If it was an inferior good, D would be negative. Okay, so what's my main point here? You were figuring out through regression all of these elasticity coefficients we just talked about. How do you do it again? You have to have data. We'll come back to that concept later, but I just want to reframe the notion of these coefficients and these equations and these notations in now elasticity context, because you understand elasticities. So there you go. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next unit here in economics. Actually, you know what? Before I do that, I want to invite, there's 9 of us. Yes, let's break it into 3 equal packages. Let us know your thought of the day. This is a good time to kind of shut me up and hear from you. And anybody can go, no order necessary. What's your thinking or your thought of the day relative to the reading or anything we talked about? Alexander, go right ahead. I got your hand raised, and then Donna.
Okay, hello, how are you doing today? First of all, I would like to talk about the elasticity because I was doing some research about it to find out how it works in the real world. So I found out that right now, for the last 7 years, or almost 10 years since Airbnb was in the business, the hotel business is crumbling because of elasticity, because they used uh, to predict the future on how to price the rooms and everything. But since this new um, Airbnb or another type of rooms that are for rent, now the management of the hotels and the prices is different because they cannot control how the environment will work and how we will react. Because now hotels are not competing with other hotels. It's not they are competing with another people, informal people that only have a room in their houses, a bed, and a bathroom. So that was interesting about the lecture today because it kind of put in perspective how the management of the hotel business is, because they were in the last 10 years they're losing business and too much money to this Airbnb. And the other thing that caught my attention between the electricity prices and everything is the hotel used to count on people reserving the rooms ahead of time, like maybe 6 months in advance, 1 year in advance, planning their vacations and everything. And now there are so many applications that you can actually rent the room while you are traveling, or actually you rent the room before you get to the hotel. So even though you can risk finding a higher price or a lower price in the hotel, depending on the how many stars the hotel has, that business for actually hotels is already gone, because now you can rent a hotel room just with an application. So the study was really interesting to about the numbers on how is the demand for hotel rooms is decreasing, because people have many options right now. So even though there's a lot of people that travel for business, and they actually want to stay in a nice place in a hotel room, all the everything that is available with the fridge and the microwave and the bed and the TV. These people that right now that is traveling, just finding a bed just to sleep the night and continue to travel and going for another place. So right now the places are booming because the hotel business is too expensive for them. To rent a room for a person that with low income is getting more and more like a luxury. And the last thing is, I was finding the research about is actually the hotel business and or the traveler for necessity. And sometimes people say, well, okay, you need to travel for work. So for you, maybe it will be a necessity. For a family of 4 or 6 that actually lives paycheck to paycheck, it may be a luxury. But sometimes for those people, they can actually find a nicer price, a lower price, because of these applications that now you can find only a room or two to rent.
Yeah. So the sum total of what you're saying is basically, because you have Airbnb and all these kinds of house sharing rental applications, but mostly it's Airbnb, the elasticity for hotel rentals has basically gone up, which is what everybody would have predicted, because you're adding another bunch of close substitutes. That's driving changes in the, but I'll just throw in quickly and then we got to keep moving on. I'm surprised that the prices aren't moving more on the hotels. I still personally find very expensive. I mean, I travel, or I used, before this pandemic, I used to travel a lot. And I rent a lot of hotel rooms, and I try to go with the cheaper ones. And I didn't, I thought prices would be in half, and they're not. I mean, they move, but not that much. Anybody have any thoughts about that, or do you notice anything different? Because according to the results of your study, there's been big movements, right, in prices?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not personally seeing it. I'm seeing smaller movements in hotel prices. And I thought it would be much bigger based on Airbnb's entry into the market. But anybody have a thought there?
When I kind of look at the changes, he talked about like business travel and such. For us, with our employer, we're not allowed to use the Airbnb, VRBO, or anything like that. So we still get stuck paying the higher prices. And I don't know if it's more of the people for the leisure that are able to use Airbnb versus the business travel. I don't know what the percentage of business travels travelers are that are able to use the Airbnb type or VRBOs.
Right. So that's a good point, which is that the elasticities are going to be different depending on whether your business, because I mean, I've heard of some companies letting employees do Airbnb, but some don't, like you said, and yours didn't. So yeah, but there's going to be different elasticity coefficients for the different customer sets. Okay, I want to keep things moving. Great point. Great example. Thanks for that. And then Donna, you were next.
Yeah, the main thing I just wanted to talk about, and it was interesting reading about the monopolies, the monopolistic competition, and the oligopolies. So it's kind of between this class and my business strategies class talking about the same thing. I was interested in looking at the same company, depending on what market they're working in, could fall into a different type of competition, because I'm looking at the oil and gas industry. In my strategies, you look at the monopolistic competition for the gas stations. You've got people that are going to go to different gas stations because, well, this one's cheaper, or I like what this company puts in their gas. So it's really interesting how they can go that way. But then in the overall of the oil and gas industry, you have the oligopolies with whether it's the Chevron, the Shell, and what the different companies offer. So I was just surprised when I started looking at the different market areas for these larger companies, that they had different types of competition that they had to face in the different areas.
Yeah, great point. And so so we're going to get into that a little bit later tonight. And so let's kind of hold that thought until later. But the idea is you don't have a monopoly everywhere. Sometimes you have it somewhere and not other places. And you gave us a great example. So perfect.
And then OPEC throws a whole nother wrench into it when they set the prices.
Right. Hopefully not for too much longer, but I'm doubtful on that. Boy, if you were taking my marketing class, you would hear me complain about our reliance on gas-powered vehicles. I talk nonstop about that and how stupid we are as a country that we do that. But that's another topic of conversation. Okay, one more. Who else would like to contribute now?
I'll go next.
Go right ahead. Great.
Something that I found really, really interesting, I guess I had never really paid attention to, was the antitrust and competition, how the Federal Trade Commission actually works. I never really realized how they took the decisions and how they allowed some mergers to happen and others not. Particularly in the communication industry. I mean, sometimes when they're doing the mergers, you think, okay, that one's going to go through, and then others don't. So I really enjoy reading that chapter because it explained a lot as to why and how they make those decisions. I mean, some of them are still probably not the best decisions, but they go ahead and do them.
Absolutely. And, just when you think there are hard and fast rules, like they talk about, there's a Herfindahl index, we're going to get into all this later. But basically, there's numerical metrics we can use to figure out if there's too much concentration in the industry and therefore deserving of being broken up or otherwise dealt with. But, like everything else in politics is politics. Politics rules everything. And depending on who's in power and how powerful the FTC is and the DOJ are at any given time, right now they're less powerful because Republicans run the government. So it devolves into a political exercise.
Yes, it does.
As much as a mathematical one. So that's a great point. Okay, any other thoughts on that? Or any of the thoughts? Good. Okay, so those are great examples. Just follow along that track when you're contributing. And I'm going to go back to our next topic, which is, speaking of the devil, market structures. Now, what we've been doing all along is just kind of defining demand curves and supply curves and talking about, actually, I got to make sure I am on the right. I am not on the right thing here, so let me get to that first. Okay, sorry. I almost didn't catch myself this time. Market structure, good, okay. So what we've been doing is looking at demand curves, supply curves, and then we talked a lot about how demand stretches or doesn't stretch depending on how you change other factors. Now what we start to seg into is how are different markets set up in terms of their structure, and we borrow some of the logic from the demand curve, supply curve, and elasticity topics to help us understand these different market structures. We're going to go through a bunch of different ones. I think it's 4 in total. starting with perfect competition. And what does all this mean? Well, let's kind of start with the basics. Profit is the overall goal, no matter which market structure you happen to find yourself in. Okay, so it's simply called the profit maximization goal. And whether you're a monopolist or a perfect competitor or a monopolistic competitor or an oligopolist, but again, what does all this mean? Hold on to that thought a second, but whoever you are, you want to maximize profit. Okay, that doesn't mean that you actually do maximize profit. Companies make bad decisions. Most companies now are tending towards unprofitability because there's too much overhead relative to demand as demand is falling. So it's not that you necessarily do or don't make profit. It's what are you trying to do? And your goal is, if you're thinking rationally as a firm, to make profit. Okay. And then point number 2 is the extent of your competition, which is kind of, you all know what competition is, but think about it in terms of substitutes too. It's the same idea. The more substitutes, the more competitors there are in an industry, that's going to dictate how you make production decisions and pricing decisions. Okay, and so that's really, the number of competitors is really the main factor that we're going to analyze as we go through the different market structures. So what are the different market structures? We start at one end of the spectrum with perfect competition. The other end of the spectrum here is monopoly. And then you have everything in between. We're going to skip dominant firm and just focus on these other two here, oligopoly and monopolistic competition. But look at the factors that differentiate. Now, number of firms in the industry, that's number 1. Barriers to entry, type of product, control over price. So we're going to go through how these all differ amongst the different kinds of market structures. So I won't belabor this now. I'll get right into perfectly competitive markets and what the factors look like there. Okay, so again, before I said the number 1 distinguishing feature between all these different market structures is how many players are there, okay? Focusing on really more so the sellers, those supplying goods. When we talk about perfectly competitive markets, there are tons of sellers. You could almost say an infinite number of sellers, even though you know it's never actually infinite. Many buyers, that's less important in terms of distinguishing between market structures, but it tends to be situations where there are more rather than less buyers. Okay, barriers to entry. What the heck is that, first of all? So if you want to, let's say you want to compete with Intel, right? We all know Intel, they make computer chips that run your computer. So what do you got to do to start selling computer chips? A lot. You have to have a lot of money. You need about $1 billion for a factory, and then probably another $1 billion for all the overhead to get it running. So it turns out that because making microchips is pretty darn expensive to set up, there's very few firms in that industry, Intel being one of them, AMD being another, and a few more, but those are the 2 major ones. But the point is, barriers to entry usually revolves around money or some law or some restriction that's keeping competitors out, or they can't even start. Okay, now look at another example, real estate offices. Okay, want to open a real estate, I love realtors, they help me buy a house, right? But the point is, it's not that hard to start a realty office and there's so many realtors. There's very low or much lower barriers to entry in that industry than there are to, say, making Intel or AMD computer chips. Okay, just to use 2 examples. Every business endeavor has some barrier to entry. It's just a question of extent. Okay, and usually it just revolves around money, but it could be other things. All right, products are homogeneous. Are we making the same thing basically again and again and again? So the classic example of this was eggs. And it's really not, nowadays it's not as good an example because eggs have been starting to be less and less homogeneous. They're more and more differentiated. But go back, 10, 20 years, you go to the egg aisle in your supermarket or the egg fridge, I guess, And pretty much every egg looked the same. Maybe it's a little different. This one's a little darker than that one, but essentially eggs are the same. Okay, so think about it. Eggs are still in that way a good example of identical products versus when you're making movies. One movie is completely different from the other. Even if they're two comedies, they're still very different. Different actors, different script, da, 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 da. Okay, so in a perfectly competitive market, products are all the same. Everybody's selling the same thing. All competitors selling the same thing. Great example here again is gas. You don't really care where you get gas most of the time, okay? Because gas is gas. You might care about where the station's located, so that's when it starts to differentiate a little bit. But as far as the gas goes, you don't care. What you care more about is the price. Okay, bullet point 4, perfect information. What does that mean? So there's this concept in economics called information asymmetries, okay? And the example I like to use here is buying a house. When you go to buy a house, God forbid you have to do that in this crazy expensive market, what's going to happen is you're going to walk into that house, you're going to see things, and you're going to say, okay, well, the floor is broken over there, there's a hole in the roof, and that has to be repaired. And so all these things that would either keep you from buying the house or that would have you negotiate the price down, you're going to see some of them. But the seller is not going to tell you about these other things that are under the carpet, in the basement, wherever else you can't find them just by a simple inspection. So right there, that's a case of what we call information asymmetry, which means that the buyer and the seller don't have the same information. Okay, the seller is not going to tell you that the kid next door gets up at 6 in the morning and plays basketball for 5 hours. They're not going to tell you that because they know you might not buy the house if they tell you that. So again, whatever the issue is, and then take this and extrapolate it to any buying situation, there are things that the seller knows that the buyer doesn't know, and conversely, sometimes there are things that the buyer knows that the seller doesn't know. But usually it's the other way around. But that's the opposite of what we're saying here, is that everybody knows the same thing. Okay, and there's information symmetry as opposed to asymmetry. Transaction costs. How many times you go into the grocery store this week? 5, 6 times? I think I went about that because, there's no TP, there's no eggs, there's no milk. So I get there and not only do I have to wait 2 hours to get in, but then I have to, I get in there and find out there's nothing available that I want. So I have to keep coming back, and that's what we mean by a transaction cost. And the assumption is that in a perfectly competitive market, there are no or very low transaction costs, which is, by definition, false. How can you ever not have a transaction cost? Even if you show up to the, a normal day at a supermarket, you still had to drive there, you still had to park, your time is worth something. So there's always a transaction cost, but the point is it's minimal, close to zero in these markets. Okay, and so again, reality diverges from some of these assumptions, but who cares? It doesn't really matter most of the time. This idea of firms being price takers, that's a very important term. When you're operating in a perfectly competitive market, you don't set price. The price gets set on you. So the I like to use the example of gas stations, right? 4 gas stations near each other, pretty much selling gas at the same price. Because if one lowers the price, then the other 3 follow and lower the price. If one raises the price, either nobody's going to go to them, or maybe the other 3 raise price if they're kind of on their game. But the point is the price is set by the group of firms in the market, and that's what we call price taking, as opposed to, your cable folks. If you have cable, they're a monopoly. So what do? They set prices high as they can get away with before the feds step in, basically. They're basically criminals. Don't tell them I said that, just in case I ever need a job there. But, that's the way it goes with the cable. You ever get your cable bill lately? Every day it goes up, and every month, up and up and up and up, because they're a monopoly. Okay, they don't take price, they set price. Now, this other idea here, bottom bullet point, is economic profit. Now, if you've taken accounting, you talk about profit, you talk about net income, you talk about net earnings. It's all profit, basically, same thing. And then we show you how to calculate profit in accounting terms, and you have revenues and expenses, and you have income tax expense, da 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 da. You net it all out, then you've got profit. So most firms that stick around for a number of years are profitable by definition. Otherwise, they would have gone out of business. And if you look at the accounting reports, like the income statement, they're going to show, $1 million, 5 million, 5 billion, whatever the number is in profits over the years. In economics, we think about profit differently. We have what's called economic profit, and it is vastly different from accounting profit. So make sure you understand that there is a distinction. Again, two different kinds of profit. And economists define profit as revenue minus what's called opportunity cost, which includes, opportunity cost includes whatever costs you would have for running the business and selling product, plus the cost of what you could do if you were doing something else in a different business. Remember, we talked about that last week, okay, and with the job example. When you're in college, you can't work, so the opportunity cost of being in college is a salary you would have gotten. So economists take a much broader view of what economic profit is than what accountants do for profit. And what winds up happening in the case of the perfectly competitive market firm is economists say, in the long run, you can't make money. It's just simply impossible. So if you're selling eggs or gas, you're not profitable. You might be able to make some profits this year and next year, but 10 years out, you're essentially unprofitable. And then you start to think to yourself, what a stupid idea. How stupid could economists be? I pass by gas stations every day. They're profitable, otherwise they wouldn't be sticking around. How can you keep selling eggs at the supermarket if there's zero economic profits? Again, they are making money from an accounting standpoint. From an economic standpoint, those kinds of businesses don't make money. And we're going to show you why in just a few slides. But I just want you to appreciate the concept of economic profit, which is much more conservative. Economists take a very grim view of most businesses and basically say they're not making money. And think about the airlines. That's basically true. Airlines, unless they get government help, or they're one of the most dominant airlines that have the most routes, most of them are just barely scraping by. And they just manage to stay in there because they get help from investors and the government. So in that industry, you tend to see something close to this idea of zero economic profit. Okay. All right. So those are the things that distinguish perfectly competitive markets from other kinds of market structures. And then we talk about how price gets set. You already know that there's an intersection between demand and supply curves, which sets the equilibrium price, the equilibrium quantity. Here, the equilibrium price is 30, the quantity is 12. So if we now say that because we are dealing with a perfectly elastic market, remember elasticity, perfect elasticity means that you change price a little bit, then demand either goes up a lot or it goes down a lot, depending on which direction you change price. But the point is that the demand curve looks horizontal in these markets because the elasticity is so high, and it's so high because you have so many substitutes you can choose from. I don't like the gas station price here. I go to the one right down the block. That one's bad. I go to the one across the street. Okay, these eggs are priced too high. I'm going to take these ones. So what happens basically, the equilibrium state is one price for the whole market, basically. With, in reality, there's a little bit of difference maybe, but it's so little, you might as well call it all the same. And that's this. That's $30. And that's your demand curve. $30 no matter what quantity is demanded. It's all the same price, 30 bucks a unit. That's what we're showing here. Now, moving on, we have to define this concept of marginal revenue. We talked about marginal benefit and marginal cost last week. And anytime you introduce the word marginal, you're talking about the next thing you do, whether it's the next consumption, the next sale, the next transaction, next unit of activity. That's all marginal. So marginal revenue then is how much revenue you're making on the next sale. And if you wanted to find it mathematically, you would just use this formula. You take the change in total revenue and you divide through by the change in quantity. Normally, we don't have to worry about that because we're not even going to need to calculate it, but that's mathematically how you calculate it. But you can think of it again as just how much revenue we're bringing in on that next sale. So you walk into the supermarket, you buy your bottle of water, and they make $1 off that transaction. Their marginal revenue was $1 on that sale. Pretty simple. Okay. Further illustrating the concept of marginal revenue, if I demand 0, there's no revenue, so total revenue is 0, and then obviously there's no marginal revenue. If I demand 1 now, then I have a total revenue of $30 because we're selling each at 30, and my marginal revenue was how much did I make on that last sale, 30 bucks. When 2 quantities of whatever are demanded, 2 water bottles, then the price is still 30 bucks because we're a perfectly competitive market. So this would be a case of water, probably not a bottle, but that's okay. The total revenue is the price times the quantity demanded is 60 bucks, but my marginal revenue is still the same. Marginal revenue in a perfectly competitive market setup does not change no matter how many quantities are demanded. So at quantity 3, marginal revenue is still 30 bucks. You're still making 30 bucks on that last sale. Okay, so this leads to an important point, and we're doing one line at a time because these graphs are going to start to get uber complicated, I promise. But when you see that horizontal demand curve, that's the same as what we're going to call the marginal revenue curve, because the marginal revenue is 30 bucks at any given quantity demanded. You can just trace it out and see the position here. Okay, and this is, again, an equilibrium price that we got back from this slide here, where the price settled out at 30 bucks. Supply and demand curve intersected at 30, leading to this curve here. Now, we talk about the marginal cost curve. Again, just introducing this one by itself. Marginal cost is what's the additional cost for each of these quantities demanded. Okay, and you see this one is not a constant. This one changes at first as quantities demanded go up, the marginal cost curve goes down, reaching a bottom point at about here, about 750 or so, okay? Then after 750, as we sell more and more and more, the marginal cost keeps going up. What's the deal with that? Well, on the downsloping part, the reason for that is you see here in the first 2 bullet points, production economies of scale and learning and efficiency, right? So when firms make more and more product, over time they get better. They save money, they find out how to be more efficient. And so that's why you see the negative slope in the curve, because you're literally reducing price for each additional unit you make and sell. The upsloping part of the curve here happens because what happens when you wear out your equipment and your people, you work them too hard, then you actually start to have diseconomies of scale, and your cost to make whatever you're making goes up, right? Because overtime is, in some respects, a really, really bad idea. Okay, we're not worrying about that now with the masks because we need the masks, but under normal circumstances, a good business will put limits on how much overtime can be spent making product, because you start to see this phenomenon go into effect, and the quality of the product goes down, not to mention. Okay, so this kind of hockey stick shape is because you have 2 kind of countervening effects happening depending on what range you are in of production, and the curve looks like this. Now, here's the most important thing I'm going to say all night in the economics module. If you remember one thing from tonight, it should be this. I want you to remember everything from tonight, but if it's one thing, let it be this. Production happens and profit is maximized where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. This concept is the same thing that we talked about last time when we looked at marginal benefit and marginal cost. Remember, we said the consumer will consume at the point at which the 2 curves cross. But back then, we talked about it in terms of marginal benefit and marginal cost. So now we're just going to change it up a little bit and say it's marginal revenue instead of marginal benefit. But think about revenue. Revenue is benefit to the firm. And we're talking about firms' profit maximization activities. So it's essentially the same thing, just in different context. Okay, so everything happens at the point at which MR equals MC. That's where you produce. That's where profit is maximized for the company, and that is also going to tell us basically what the equilibrium of the situation is. So let's put it back onto the graph. The graph's starting to get a little bit more complicated because we're combining curves. The marginal revenue curve for a perfectly competitive firm looks like this, horizontal, and we say demand equals the marginal revenue. Okay. The marginal cost curve, which we stole from the other graph, looks like this. So where are the two intersecting? Right here at this point. What's the quantity? 2,000 units. What are we making here? Maple syrup. Okay. Are going to be produced and sold at a price of $30. The $30 we already knew because we looked at the demand curve from before, but you can see it here too. Okay, so we have the equilibrium going on here. This intersection dictates production and sales. It's just that simple, actually. Now, if you produce in this region, what happens? Your marginal cost exceeds your marginal revenue. Look at the curves. Marginal cost is above marginal revenue in this region to the right of equilibrium, which means you are making unprofitable units. Who the heck wants to do that? You have to be stupid to keep operating in that region. If you are operating in this region, your marginal revenue is higher than your marginal cost. So you're not making enough profitable units because as you move further away from wherever you are in here towards equilibrium, you're making more and more profit. And remember again, the concept of surplus, it's the same thing. The firm is giving up some of its surplus by producing to the left of the equilibrium. Okay, so we produce right here at a quantity of 2 grand and a price of 30. And then what can happen is the input costs, which is basically the marginal cost curve, can shift. Remember, we saw shifts in demand, shifts in supply. Well, cost curves can shift too. And the way it works is if you see a shift to the left, then you have a increasing cost situation. If you have a shift to the right, you have a decreasing cost situation. And what that's going to do then is have an effect on that equilibrium quantity of units produced, and then of course on profitability. So let's look at the graph. Here was our demand curve equals the marginal revenue curve. What happened? At that intersection point, we were producing 2,000 units at a price of $30. Okay. Costs now are going to increase, which means you show it graphically as a leftward shift of the marginal cost curve. So now it's at MC1. And we look for a new intersection point, which occurs right here at 1,500 quantity and still a $30 price. The price doesn't change. Your cost change, but your price doesn't change because you're a price taker in a perfectly competitive market. Okay, so what's the upshot? The upshot is you went from selling 2,000 units to selling 1,500 units because of this cost increase, because something in your cost structure went up. You know, the cost of the raw material, the cost of the labor to make the maple syrup, whatever it was. We don't know, but you'll know in real life when you have to do this. So production went down, sales went down, and as we're going to show a little bit in a few slides later, profitability winds up going down. But from the economist's standpoint, we don't like this because you're producing less. You went from 2,000 production to 1,500 production. And what do we always want in economics? We want companies to produce more. The more you produce, the better, because then more people get to consume. And we like seeing more people rather than less people consume. So this is bad news, okay, with economists. Now, let's do about 2 more slides here, and then we're going to take a nice little break. So we've been talking about cost. We've been talking about marginal revenue. I want to show you how profit gets displayed, because at the end of the day, that's really what matters, is profit to most companies, all companies, and to economists as well. So the first thing is, remember the rule. The rule that sets everything up is produce and sell where MR equals MC, where those two curves intersect. Okay. now the second rule is the profit at that level of production and sales is going to be equal to whatever revenue they're making in total at that point of production and sales minus the total opportunity cost at that level of production and sales. The way we define it more mathematically is we take, and I'm looking right here at this term here, price minus what's called the average total cost. We do it on a per unit basis, then we multiply it by how many units we're making and selling, which again is determined by this. And that's going to tell us what the profitability is. And so, you know, here's your formal definition of ATC. It's your total cost over the quantity produced. It equals your average total cost. But really what matters is, can you do it on the, can you look at it on the graph and figure out what's going on? So let's add yet another curve here. The ATC curve is the green curve, which looks mostly like the marginal cost curve, but it's a little bit more of a U shape as opposed to a hockey stick shape. So, and it's going to be shifted to the right versus the MC curve, and don't worry about why that is. But here's how it goes. The first thing you do in all these situations is figure out how much we're producing. What's the quantity produced? The rule there is see where the MR curve, the red curve, intersects the MC or blue curve at point A. That dictates production of 2,000. And we already know the price is 30. It's always going to be 30 in a perfectly competitive market. Okay, so we know quantity produced. And now to figure out profitability, you trace the quantity produced through two distinct points. One is the price point or the demand curve. The demand curve tells us price is charged, but we know it's always 30, and it's right here at point A, 30. And then you trace that down to, or up to, in this case it's down to, the average total cost curve, which is at $20. Okay, so how much are we making on each unit? Basically 30 minus 20 or 10 bucks. Okay, is the amount made on probably a case of maple syrup. I don't know. Gallons. It's done in gallons, per gallon. Okay, so, okay, I know how much we're making per unit. What about all the units I sell? Well, you're selling 2,000 units, right? You can trace from here all the way down to the 0 point. So when you do this graphically, you encapsulate a green area, which, if you remember your geometry rules, right, what's the area of a rectangle? It's the length times width. The length is 0 to 2,000 is 2,000 times the width is 30 minus 20 is 10. So 10 times 2,000 is $20,000 of profit. And it's represented by this green section here, which again looks at point A, traced to point B, carried out over a distance of, in this case, 2,000 units. Okay, that's how you graphically represent profit, and then you can calculate it with the numbers. But again, the rule is, first, I'll just go over it quickly, and then we'll take a break. Trace out where MR intersects MC. That gives you the quantity. At that quantity, look at the difference between demand curve and average total cost curve. And that gives you the profit per unit, and multiply that out by how many units you're producing, and that gives you total profit. Okay, any questions or thoughts on that? Otherwise, we will break for 15 minutes, so I will see you back at roughly 7:47. And I'm going to pause recording. Okay. Okay, welcome back. I'm going to pick up right where we left off. And let's see, yes, we actually did this slide, so I am going to now go to the next slide, which demonstrates the concept I was mentioning before, which is, you know, most of the time you wind up having, in the long run, I shouldn't say most of the time, all of the time, according to economists, the long run situation is that you make zero economic profit in a perfectly competitive market. Again, you have to understand that distinction, because that is going to change when we start talking about monopolists and some of the other market structures. So in the case of perfect competitors, what's happening in the long run is, well, here's your, this is a different, apparently a different set of circumstances, because we're talking about the long run. This curve here is a short run curve. The reason I know that is because you see green. Green means profit. And if you're making economic profit, then it can only be in the short term, because in the long run or the long term, economists say that perfect competitors cannot make any profits. Okay, the best they can do is break even. So that's what's shown here. Here's your demand curve, here's your marginal cost curve. They intersect at 1500 quantity, and the average total cost curve is just at the same place here as the demand curve. They're all three are intersecting in the same place. So you have 1500 quantity times 0 margin. Because how do you figure out margin? You look at the difference between demand, which is price, and then you look at the average total cost curve, but they're the same at the same point. So it's a 0 profit per margin. And so that's demonstrating, again, 0 economic profit, which is the case for, again, perfect market competitor firms in the long run. In the short run, you may have 0 economic profit. You may have some positive profit. You may have loss. But in the long run is always this, according to economists. Okay. Now, let's look at the loss situation. Again, how do I know if I have a loss? Well, first look at where MR equals MC. That determines equilibrium quantity of production and sales. And then I trace the difference again between price and average total cost at the point of production where MR equals MC. So what it looks like then is this graph. Okay, and this, let's kind of go through the logic again. Look at where the demand curve, which is the marginal revenue curve, intersects marginal cost, which is the blue curve, and the intersection point is at about, what is it, 1700 units? I'm sorry, not 16, it's about 1300 units or so, some number like that. And then trace up that quantity and look at the difference between your average total cost curve and your demand curve. At this time, it's flipped. It's flipped because your average total cost curve is higher than your marginal revenue curve at the equilibrium production quantity. So the difference between these two carried out over whatever that number is, I think it's 1300, is going to be red, which is an economic loss. Okay, and so the area of the rectangle, I'm looking at my own slide here, is 3,900. So you're losing rather $3,900, and this is how you demonstrate it. Again, this can happen in the short term. In the long run, it probably won't happen because you'll be out of business before it can happen that long. But this is how you illustrate it. And what's the difference again? This green curve is now above the demand curve, the red curve, at the point of production. Before, it was the reverse. I'll just show you that diagram again. Here, the average total cost curve is below the demand curve at the point of production. And then the other case, it was all in the same place. So therefore, you had 0 profit. So the rules are pretty simple. At that point where MR equals MC, if price is greater than average total cost, you've got positive economic profit. If they're equal, you've got 0 economic profit. If it's the last situation we saw where average total cost is above the price or demand curve or marginal revenue curve, then you've got negative economic profits, otherwise known as a loss. Okay, and again, these concepts, these numbers are different than what an accountant would tell you. Accountants don't deal in economic profit or loss. Economists do, and that's a key distinction you want to understand. Now, related to all this is the question of when does a firm shut down, an unprofitable firm shut down? And the economists have figured out that it follows one very simple rule that basically avoids all of this other stuff that we're talking about. What did we do before? We looked at where MR equals MC, we did some tracing, blah, 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 and we figured it all out, what the profit was. Here, the decision is, do we stay open or do we close? And the decision is driven quite simply by a comparison among price and average variable cost. Average variable cost is kind of sort of like marginal cost, but it's a little bit different. I won't get into the key distinctions between the two, but you know, if you would ever want to use this, and I don't see most of you ever using this, you would want to explore what variable cost is all about, and you learn a lot about that in management accounting. But the upshot of it quickly is variable cost is basically the same as marginal cost in most cases. Okay. And then you have average, you know, taking the average, which means it takes the total over the quantity, and you figure out that total over the quantity at every given quantity, and that produces your AVC curve. So let's look at the curve itself. The one we added now was this AVC curve. It's red, and it kind of sort of looks like average total cost, and it kind of sort of looks like marginal cost, but it's probably more like the average total cost curve, except shifted to the left. But anyway, however this curve gets derived, here it is. And the rule basically is look at where the bottommost point of that AVC curve happens. And it's right here, right? Because if you go to the right, it goes up. If you go to the left, it goes up. But it occurs at a bottom here of, trace it out, of about $10. So the rule then is, if you cannot sell your product for more than $10 or more, then you shut down. That's it, because you're never going to be profitable ever, from an economic standpoint, and certainly from an accounting standpoint, because economics is more conservative. Okay, so it's a very simple rule. Go to the AVC curve, find the bottommost point, trace the price out, and if you're selling product below that price, it's time to shut down. So if I can sell product at $11, I'm going to stay open. If I can sell product at $12, I stay open. If I can sell product at $10.01, then theoretically I would stay open. You know, then it gets into whether the owners really want to do business at such low profit margins. But theoretically, I would still be open. Once the price drops to $9.99, close, done, out of here. Firm shuts down. Okay, so it's a comparison between price and AVC. Last slide here in this module is what happens when we have changes in price driven by things like changes in demand and supply. So, you know, because nothing stays the same, right? We see everything going on nowadays with goods. But in any given market situation, you're going to have changes in supply and demand. So the original situation is, here's a supply curve. Here's the original demand curve. We intersected here at a price of 15 and a quantity of 1.5. Now we have a demand shift out to the right. Demand increased. So the new intersection point is up here at a quantity of 2 and a price of 30. So let's trace out what happens in the firm profitability case. So in the old situation, this was our old demand curve at a price of $15. Because again, this was the price over here at 15 bucks. The market basically sets the price at 15 bucks, and all firms, including this one, are a price taker at 15. So we look to see where demand or marginal revenue intersects with marginal cost, which is right here at this point of 1500 quantity. And then we see what the difference between average total cost and demand curve is. It's all the same, right? Here's your demand curve at 15, and then the average total cost curve is right on the same mark here at 15 at this equilibrium quantity. So that's a zero profit situation, and there's no rectangle to draw in this case because it's a point. But then what happened is price rose to 30 bucks, so now we draw a new demand curve, and we start the process all over. MR equals MC right here. The marginal cost curve didn't move because it was a price change for the product driven by an increase in demand. So MC stayed the same. So MC0 is still MC0. Intersects over here now at this point, traced down to a quantity of 2,000, which is the same quantity as here. And now we can figure out what the profitability would be. We look at, again, what is average total cost doing relative to the demand curve. So we have 30 minus what looks like about 22, 23. So about, let's just call it $7 of margin per unit times now 2,000 units. So about 14 1,000 in profit or whatever, plus add some zeros because the things are probably in thousands or millions, okay? But again, what's going on in this case is what happened. Price went up from 15 to 30 at the new equilibrium, and now we have profitability shown by the difference between this intersection point and this intersection point carried over a rectangle of 2,000 units. So the green is not drawn in there, but if I had the capability, you would see something similar to what we saw a few slides ago. Let me just review that quickly. This kind of situation, right? We had a green, because again, what happened? The demand curve at the point of equilibrium is above the average total cost curve. Okay, so the moral of the story is you got to get your curves straight. It can, I look at a graph like this, it drives me nuts. This is when you start to, question your own sanity when you're trying to follow all these lines. But just follow the rules we said. MR equals MC. Trace the 2 margin points from the demand curve down to or up to the average total cost curve, and that gives you your rectangle of profitability, your rectangle of loss, or in this case over here, it was 0 profitability. Okay, and that is all I want to say on perfectly competitive markets. Let's see, we're about 8 o'clock. I want to make sure I get to enough statistics, so I'm going to switch gears now and talk about statistics. So let me do a new share here with you. And we left off at kind of a strange place. We were talking about means and medians and different kinds of averages. And the main point we were making was that if you have an outlier, then you should be using median. If you don't have outliers, then the mean is probably the best average to use. And so where I want to pick up then is to talk about percentiles. If you've ever taken a standardized test like the SAT or the GMAT, you get a score back on usually a scale from like 200 to 800, but also you get a percentage. And the percentage you're getting is a percentile, which means that you did better than whatever that percentile you scored at of all the people who took the test. So if you're at the 75th percentile, that means you did better than 75% of the people who took the test. Okay, that's really the way to think about percentiles. And you can do any percentile between 0 and, well, 0 wouldn't make sense, but 1 to 100 are candidates for percentiles. But there are certain numbers that tend to get more used, like 75%, like 50%, which is the median, 25%, and then sometimes you have like 80 or 90, increments of 10. But you can calculate a percentile on any number that you want. So I'm going to show you how to do this in Excel. We're going to look at these training competency exam scores. So I'm going to keep switching windows here. And I'm going to share Excel back in Chapter 2. I notice there are tabs down here, so I'm clicking on Chapter 2 if you want to look at this at your own leisure. But percentile, you're going to type in equals percentile. And there's the exclusive and inclusive. I'm going to take the exclusive. So by the way, there's 2 ways you can do this. So let me start over again. You can do percentile, and then when you see it come up, just click on it. Or you can type the whole thing out, whatever you want to do. Sometimes I do one, sometimes I do the other. But now it's asking you for an array, which is the data that you want to calculate a percentile on. And let's say that I want to have a 75 percentile identification in this data set. So I'm going to put in a comma, and then it says K. K is your percentile. So I put in 0.75. Don't forget the decimal point. I was doing this the other day, and I forgot the decimal point, and it wouldn't give me an answer. It needs a decimal point, or I think you can do 75 with a percent sign too. So I click here and look at the number that I get back, 85.75. Is that even in the data set? No. If you look at all these numbers, it's it's not in there. What it's close to is either the 87 or the 82, I guess would be the two numbers it's between. So what Excel is doing is it's doing a bit of what's called interpolation. It's kind of like calculating an average, but it's an average weighted towards where the 75th percentile is closer to. So it's closer to the 87 than it is to the 82. But a score of 85.75 rounded to 86 would be a 75th percentile score in this case. As you have more and more data points, here we only have, about 10 or 11. You get results like this where the number is not in the original set. But if I had like 100 points here, 100 scores, then when I did this calculation, you would have to have one right at the 75th spot. So you would get back a number that was in the set, like 42 or 87, whatever it happened to be. Okay, so don't be alarmed by this kind of result. You'll get it. Let me do another one for the group 2. And 90 is not in this group anywhere. And that's okay, because it's, again, a bit of interpolation going on. And that's how you do percentages, or percentiles rather, on Excel. Pretty simple. Okay, back to my slide. The last kind of central tendency measure is the mode. And this is the easy one. If you have a small data set, you can just eyeball it. If you have a large data set, it actually turns out to be a little harder. But it's the thing or the score that occurs the most. And this is typically used on what we call qualitative data, which means you're not really dealing with numbers, you're dealing with things. The things can happen to be numbers. So you'll understand that in a second. But we don't like to use mode because bullet point 2 here, it's the least precise measure of central tendency. You're only using it because you have to, right? So, there's 100 people in the room. How many are male or how many are female? I can't take an average of gender. Doesn't make sense. What's the average gender? Well, no, there's 60 females and 40 males. That's the way you describe the data set. And then you say, okay, there's more females than males. So the mode then would be females, okay? It's what we call a nominal designation, which may or may not, and usually is not a number or a value. So this is almost starts to insult your intelligence, telling you how to figure out mode. Let's just go right to an example. We'll look at politics here. We have Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. How many of them are here in this column? So what is the mode? The mode is actually independents, because we have 140 of them, and that's more than 70 and more than 90. Notice I didn't say the mode was 140. It's the thing, in this case, it's the party affiliation that happens to be the mode, because you have more independents than Republicans and Democrats. The frequency is higher. Okay, so be careful when you're reporting and talking about modes that you actually pick the thing that is the most frequently occurring. Not the number itself is not the mode. The number of occurrences, that is. Okay, now here's an interesting wrinkle. What happens if we have 20 Democrats, 20 Republicans, and 15 independents? What's the mode in that case? Well, in this case, we have what is known as a bimodal distribution, which means you have two modes, thus the word bimodal. You can have bimodal, you can have trimodal, quadrimodal, quintimodal, whatever the words used to describe multiple modes are. You can have more than one, and that's fine. It just means you have multiple modes, okay? So it's not just one answer. And usually modes stop at 3 or 4. It's not usually more than that in most data sets, but sometimes it can be more. If the data is presented in this fashion, this was what we used to calculate weighted averages from last week, if you remember. This makes life easy. We can eyeball this mode very quickly just by looking at the highest frequency. And this was basically the same as this chart, right? Now we're looking at scores. And the highest frequency is right here at 65. So the mode here is 3. It's not 65, it's 3. You always go to the thing and report that as the mode. And didn't I just tell you that mode isn't numbers? Well, it can be a number. It's just that the number is treated as the thing. Here it's a score on a scale of 1 to 5. And the mode of those scores is 3, the most frequently occurring score at 65 occurrences. Okay, now, Excel-wise, we can use Excel to find single modes, and then I'm going to show you this example is multiple modes on Excel, so let me switch back. Again, these slides, they're the directions. You can follow them when you need to do this. I just go right to the Excel and show it to you there because it's just easier to show you than to talk about it. So here we go. Going out to the right here, I have the unimodal data set, and to find a mode on Excel, you type in equals mode. Now look at this, you have mode and mode single. Since I'm finding a single mode, I'm going to pick this one by clicking on it, or I could just keep typing it. And then it's asking me for the numbers. So I'm going to just get this data set in there by dragging on it, close parenthesis, and there you go. 1 is the mode, because if I literally count up all the ones, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 ones, and that apparently is the most frequently occurring number in this data set, right? If I look at the 3s, there's only 1, 2, yeah, I think there's only 2 3s, and I could keep doing this 3 3s, sorry, there's one over here. I can keep doing this exercise for 4s and 5s, and you're going to find out that 1 is the winner in terms of the number of times it occurs, okay? Now, you start to say to yourself, why the hell do I need Excel to do something so simple? Imagine this was like all the way down the screen, like you had 3,000 data points, right? That's when Excel gets really, really helpful, okay? Here, we're just making it short so that you can see it. But, in a data set this small, or, on this one, I don't need Excel to tell me what the mode is. I can figure it out. Okay, now, this is a unimodal data set, which means I rigged it so that there's only one mode occurring there. Here's a data set where you have multiple modes, and I'm going to show you how to use Excel to figure out the multimodal modes. And the problem is you don't really necessarily know if there's going to be multiple modes, but if you suspect that's the case, then you would want to use this function, equals equals mode mult. So I'm going to click on this first one, mult for multiple. And so I'm just showing you that by way of introduction. Actually, the way you do it, you have to actually know a little bit more to do this one. This one's a little bit tricky. What you do is you try to guess ahead of time just about how many modes you think you're going to have. So I'm going to guess like there's going to be about 4 of them. There's only 1 through 5, so probably it's either 1, 2, 3, or 4, maybe even 5. But I'm just going to guess that it's going to be 4 different modes. So I'm going to actually highlight 4 cells where I want the modes to show as results, and then without doing anything else, I type equals, which is going to put it in that top cell that I highlighted. Mode mult. Make sure you're doing mode mult. Open parentheses, and now drag your data, and only the data that you want. Close parentheses, and then you have to do this fancy entry. It's Control Shift Enter. So you can't see my hands, but I'm doing Control Shift Enter, and this is what you get back. Okay, look what happened. So Excel is saying 1 was a mode, 4 was a mode, and then this is just garbage because there's only 2 modes, but I wanted to have these spaces there in case there were more than 2 modes, okay? So, you can just, well, it's not letting me delete that. Probably got to do 1 at a time. No, it won't even let me delete it. Okay, so never mind. We're not going to bother Excel about it. But the answer is 1 is a mode, 4 is a mode, and they're tied. So it's a bimodal distribution. If you had a number here, it'd be trimodal. If you had a number here as well, it would be quadrimodal. And that's how you do modes on Excel, multiple modes on Excel. Again, you have to have an inkling or a suspicion that there are more than one mode going on in this data set, if you use this function, the single mode function, on a multimodal data set, I think Excel just kind of picks a winner somehow. I don't even know. I never looked into it, but my guess is it'll pick either the 1 or the 4, and maybe it picks the lower one or the higher one. I don't know. But the point is, don't use this function if you think you have this kind of a situation going on. And the safe route is always to do multi-modes, because the worst case scenario is you'll get just one number up here and everything else will be in NA. Okay, so beware of that. Yes.
I was just curious, how would you apply this? When I'm looking at this, I'm thinking about surveys.
Mhm.
You know, on a Likert scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10.
Yes.
I don't know. That's just what I've never done it, but I've seen it like this, where you're asking specific questions and you want to see that outcome, or at least that mode of answering based on a group of people, you know, asking specific kinds of questions. And then with the bimodal, I guess you could use, you could ask specific questions and change the score. So you could have a score of 1 to 5 that people choose from, and then maybe a score of 5 to 10 on a different kind of question you're asking. I don't know, just doing surveys. I don't do a lot, but I think that this is one example of a real life application.
Well, yeah, survey analysis makes a lot of use of modes, and you know, let's put it this way: if you're getting a lot of data, like let's say you're surveying 40,000 people, okay, the likelihood is you're not going to have an exactly bimodal or trimodal result. It's going to be more like, you know, 19,999 people said score of 3, and then 20,001 said a score of 4.
Oh, yeah, that's not.
So, but the thing is, effectively, statistically, that is bimodal, because the numbers of the tallies are so close to each other that you would consider them. And you know, when you use more advanced software, not Excel, you can set those parameters about how much they can, you know, differ by, to call them bimodal or trimodal. Okay, so really, to answer the main point of your question, which is how do I use it, is that this gets used in survey analysis all the time, where you just want to report what are most people saying. It's the mode. And then are there ties, in which case you have bimodal, trimodal. And again, it doesn't have to be exactly the same.
Okay.
Yeah, great question. Okay, so let's go back to, I think we're on to the next topic now. But let me confirm that. Yes, we did multiple modes. And then the summary, again, you've heard this probably 3,000 times already, but let's just do it one more time. Don't use the mode unless you're forced into it, which means you have categorical or qualitative data like eye color, political party. Again, you can use it with numbers as scores, but you're not doing yourself justice if I can take actual averages and medians of that. I would rather do that. But that's a judgment call. You use median when you have numbers. You use mean when you have numbers. The difference is median works better when there are outliers. Mean works better when there are not outliers. How do I know if I have an outlier? Well, we're going to show you a very precise way, if not later tonight, then next week. But there are very precise ways to know. Sometimes it's just obvious. Other times you figure it out using statistics. Okay, so that's that unit, and now I'm going to go on to the next stats module, which is variability. So let me get there. And of course, nothing is ever in the right order that you want it. But here we are, variability. What we are talking about here is the extent to which data differs from itself across the entire spectrum of the data. Okay, that's essentially variability, which is maybe harder to understand versus when I just show you the numbers, but that's the formal definition. You will also see the terms spread, dispersion, scatter. But, you know, think about a herd of cats, right? There's always the joke, it's like herding cats. You can have cats that are all right together. You can have cats that are like all over the place, which is usually what they want to do. So that's a scatter. And we're going to look at the same concept with regard to the numbers now. So it turns out that there are 3 main measures of variability. We're going to go through each of the 3, range, standard deviation, and variance. The one that's most important by far is standard deviation, so we'll spend the most time there. Remember last week I told you, by way of introduction in statistics, that data has a personality. It behaves a certain way, just like people have personalities, right? They're kind, they're stingy, they're whatever, you know, you deal with all different personality types. So you can describe people personalities, you can describe data personalities. The main way statisticians describe data personalities is what you see right here, a mean and a variability in parentheses. So one particular data set, this one, has a mean of 25.2 and a variability, which is actually, it's the variance, of 3.6. Okay, and that actually, those 2 numbers actually tell us a lot about how this data is behaving. We can do a hell of a lot with that, which you're going to see throughout the rest of the course. All right, so that's the introduction. Let's talk about the range, which, as I kind of alluded to a second ago, not that great a measure. You know, the only one that really gets used most of the time is standard deviation. But every now and then you run into the range, and that's fine. The range is so simple to calculate, yet the weird thing is that Excel doesn't actually even have a range, maybe because it's so simple, I don't know, function. So you have to kind of make it up as you go along. But basically, range is just looking at the high point and the low point and subtracting them. Okay, what's the highest score? What's the lowest score? Subtract them and you got a range. Okay, and then it turns out there are 2 kinds of ranges. You have the exclusive, which is just high minus low, and then the inclusive takes that difference and adds 1, and you'll see why in a second you would add 1. So let's go right to the examples. Okay, we have a simple data set, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which I know is your password, right, on everything. So no laughs there? Okay, come on, guys. Help me out here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Simple data set. What's the exclusive range? Just take the high point minus the low point, and you've got it. 5 minus 1 is 4. That's the exclusive range. The inclusive range is take the result you just got and add 1 to it. So 4 plus 1 is 5. So think about it. You know, this range was 4. The exclusive range was 4. The inclusive range was 5. Why would I want to use this inclusive range? Well, because think about it, like you're spanning 5 numbers here. So by doing that little add 1, it kind of gives you a little bit more of a idea of what the numbers are physically spanning in this data set rather than just taking the highest minus the lowest. So this is, you know, one of these judgment calls. Which ones do you use? Most people use exclusive. That's kind of the standard. Every now and then you run into an inclusive, and I'll leave it at that. Okay, just know how to calculate both and what they entail. So let's go to the Excel. We're going to look at, again, these training competency scores. And I'm going to just copy these questions here into Excel so that I don't have to keep switching back and forth. So let me go back to the Excel share. And now we are in chapter 3. So I'm going to check. Oh, that's a nice simple one. I like that. And let's kind of just paste this over here. And it says, what's the exclusive range of group 1? So what I have to do on Excel is figure out a max. I have to figure out a min, and then I can figure out, I'll call it E range, exclusive range. So to do a max, again, you could eyeball it. I know the highest score here just by eyeballing it in group 1 looks like that 89. But let's get technical about it, because you might have a huge data set and can't do that. But so tell Excel to find the max, MAX, of this data set. Now we're going to find the minimum. Tell Excel to find the min of this data set. close parenthesis, check mark. And now just tell Excel to subtract these two, the max. So I'm just going to click on the max number minus the min number. And I've got the answer, 89. Okay, that's an exclusive range. Now I'm going to drag this whole kit and caboodle over to group 2. So now I have the data for group 2. And now we can answer the questions. What's the exclusive range of group 1? It's 89. What's the exclusive range of group 2? 86. Which group has more variability? The higher number wins. So 1 is slightly more variable than 2 using the range measure. But again, if you're relying on this range measure to make that statement, that declarative statement, then you're a fool, because we have a way better way of doing that, which we're going to get into in 2 seconds here. Okay, but that's how you do range on Excel. Again, there's no, you have to get into this whole shebang here because there's no one measure of range, which I don't understand. I think that would be the easiest thing to program, but what do I know? I just abide by the rules. I don't make them. So, okay, let's go back to the slides. We answered these questions. Okay, so here's where I really want to take you. It's the standard deviation, because this is the holy grail measure of variability. So let's understand it conceptually first before we get into formulas and Excel methodologies. We have two very, very simple data sets here. Alpha, which is 4, 4, and 4, and then beta, which is 2, 4, 6, okay? So the very simple question I have for you is, what is the mean of each data set? What's the mean of alpha? Don't even calculate, just tell me. Mean of alpha is 4. Okay, I like the fingers, great, 4. Right? The average of 4, 4, and 4 is 4. I don't need Excel to tell me that, it's just an eyeballer. What's the average of data set beta? 4, same answer, right? Okay, now, the question is, bullet point 2 here is, which mean, we just found 2 means, both 4, is stronger, alpha or beta? And what do I mean by stronger anyway? Well, alpha, I mean, there's no question. The mean of that data set is 4, because every data point is 4. So if I'm using the mean to describe each data point, 4, 4, and 4, that's a pretty darn accurate description of every single data point. The mean of this data set is 4, but if I'm using 4 to describe this point here, I'm 2 away. If I'm using 4 to describe this data point, I'm 2 away, because 6 and 4, the difference is 2. I'm right on the money on the middle one here, but these 2 guys on the end, the mean is not that good of a representation of these 2 scores. So the stronger mean is right here, because this data set doesn't vary. It's the same thing over and over again. This data set does vary around its mean, much more so than this data set varies around its mean, which is 0. There's no variance around the mean. Okay, so stronger mean is alpha by far. And that's the points I'm making here in the bottom bullet points. Okay, the higher variability, again, here. So with that in mind, that's basically what standard deviation is trying to tell you is, do you have a 4, 4, 4 situation, or do you have a 2, 4, 6 situation? And then, of course, I mean, there's millions of other, infinite number of other possibilities. But when you're calculating a standard deviation, here's what you do. I'm going to skip right to the formula over here. You already recognize X bar. That's the mean of any data set, right? The center point of any data set. What you then do is you look at differences between the center point and any given score in the data set. Okay, kind of like I just did here, where I said 2 was 2 away from 4, 6 was 2 away from 4, 4 being the mean. I take those differences and I square them. And the reason why you square them is because you want to exaggerate any differences that exist. When you square something, you make a small quantity exponentially bigger, basically. Okay, so take those differences, exaggerate them, and then add all that stuff up. That's what this sigma means here. When you see a sigma right here at the left, it means add. Okay, so I'm adding together all these differences squared, and then dividing by how many differences I have, or really how many pieces of data in the data set. So if I go back to this data set, n was 3, and this data set, n was also 3, because I have 3 pieces of data. Very simple. And then you do this thing, subtracting 1, which I'm going to talk about in about 2 seconds. Why am I subtracting 1? Well, because I told you so, but there's a statistical reason for it, okay? And then when I finish figuring out the sums on top and dividing through by the sample size, essentially, I take a square root to undo the squaring that I did before, okay? And that's it. You don't even have to worry about this because Excel is going to do it for you in a nanosecond, and you don't worry about the formula, but I want you to understand conceptually what's going on. So this is everything I just talked about. We define symbols. Now let's get into this why the n minus 1. Again, this is not going to help you make your business run smoother, but I just want you to understand conceptually what's going on. You would ordinarily divide by just plain n, but now you're doing n minus 1 because if you look at this formula, you're making, by subtracting 1, you're making the denominator smaller. When you make a denominator smaller, you make the whole number bigger. And so that's what you're trying to do. You're actually trying to inflate the standard deviation by a little bit because you're taking a sample standard deviation. Notice the symbol here, the S. That refers to sample standard deviation, okay? If this was a population, you would see a sigma, which will come up a little bit later. But here we're saying if you're looking at a sample, and most of the time you're looking at a sample, because again, you don't talk to everybody because you can't afford it, you don't have time. You're going to use the n minus 1 version because it inflates standard deviation, which means you're producing what's called an unbiased estimate right here in bullet 2, which means that it's more conservative, okay? Because what you're going to see in the rest of the course, probably starting next week, is we use standard deviation for everything. You know, it's like a chef uses a knife. Statisticians use standard deviation to do hypothesis tests and data analysis, and it's pretty much everything out there makes use. So you want this number to not, you never want to underestimate variability. The worst thing you can do is underestimate variability. The best thing you can do is overestimate it, and that's why we have this n minus 1. If none of that makes sense to you, then who cares? It doesn't matter because you're not going to have to worry about it. You're just going to use the results. Okay. So a couple of points of review or a little new information here. What is standard deviation? It's looking at, on average, how far are each of the data points from the mean. Yes, it's not quite that when we subject it to the formula, but more or less that's what you're going for conceptually with a standard deviation. If the number is bigger, that means you have higher variability, higher scatter, whatever word you want to use. But you know, again, the 246 had a higher standard deviation than the 444. So as that standard dev number goes up, you have more variation, which means the points are on average further and further away from that mean value. Standard deviation, bullet point 3 acts a lot like the mean. What was the problem with the mean? Outliers. Outliers distort means. So they're also going to distort standard deviations. There actually is not much of a workaround for that other than just dropping your outliers out of your data set. Just take them out because there's really only one measure of standard deviation that gets used, of variability that gets used, and it's standard deviation. Now, that's the one advantage, incidentally, of it can be an advantage of using range. If the outlier is at the end, which normally you would expect it to be there, then that rule goes out the window. But don't worry about that. Just understand that there's a limitation. In the rare case, you get a standard deviation equal to 0. That means there's no variability. Where did we see that? That's this data set, 4, 4, and 4. If it was 5, 5, and 5, I would say the same thing. That's a standard deviation of 0. Okay, but 4, 4, 5, you're going to have some variability there. It's going to be low, but it's something. Okay, so how do I do this on Excel? Well, the first thing I want you to realize is I have 2 slides here. One is for a sample standard deviation. One is for a population standard deviation. So make sure you know which one you need to calculate And it's a very simple rule. The rule is, are we dealing with a sample or a population, right? If you're trying to predict who's going to win the next presidential election and you're talking to 30,000 people, well, that's obviously a sample because there's 300 million plus people in the country. Okay, but let's say you're doing the census, which we're getting in the mail now, right? Everybody's got to do the census. That's a population. So you would use the standard deviation population function to do that standard deviation. So let's look again at these training competency scores. And the question is, do they differ by a lot? And then we're going to look at standard deviations for each of them, which is going to basically answer the question, so we don't have to kind of eyeball it. So here we go. Back to Excel. And we're still in chapter 3. I'm going to delete this. We did the range. I'm going to delete that. So what do I have here? Basically, take your pick, okay? You can do a standard deviation population or standard deviation sample. I'm going to do both, actually. Standard deviation P. Oops, and I have to put an equal sign here. Let me start over. I didn't like the way that goes. Equals standard dev, because I want you to see that it comes up, and you can pick it, which I'm going to do here. And I'm doing a population standard deviation because of this P here. And then just drag over the data and click. And then, actually I want it under here, so I'm going to move it over. And then we're going to call this standard dev for the population. P for population. Okay. And now I'm going to do a standard dev sample. So I'm going to copy this down here and change this to an S. Oops. That should not have happened. So I'm going to just rearrange. Okay. Equals ST. You see the choice here, so I'm going to double click it. If you want to do that, that's fine. And I'm going to drag over the same data, close parentheses, and then check mark. Okay. And let's just drag it over to do the group 2 as well. And I don't like these big numbers. What I usually will wind up doing is going to the Home tab and just giving this a little haircut, just because it makes it easier to look at, okay? Now, let's look at the first thing. For any given data set, group 1 or group 2, how do the population and sample standard deviation differ? Very little. These numbers are pretty close to each other. Same goes here, okay? The one universal truth is that this number will always be higher than this number. Why? Because it's that n-1 effect, right? Sample standard deviation is more conservative, which means it's inflated, which means it's higher number-wise versus the population standard deviation, okay? So you see that in both cases. And then again, are these numbers really all that different? No, they're pretty close. It's not always going to happen. Sometimes you will get a bigger shift. It depends on the data. But in this case, they're pretty close. Again, which one do I use? Again, it depends on, are these samples or is this the population, right? Let's say this is your entire workforce. You have a 10-person workforce. That's a population. Okay, let's say you have a 500-person workforce and you're only testing 10 employees. Then it's a sample. So you would use this number. All right, so it really depends on what you got going into this analysis. Okay, so the next thing you would do is try to compare variabilities. You say, okay, let's just look at the population. Let's assume they're populations. Is the variation or the standard deviation different between these two groups? Basically, eyeballing it, the answer is no. If I go to the sample case, the answer is still basically no. But what did I say last week? Statistical testing is the boss. You can't say two numbers are the same or that they're different until a statistical test lets you do that. So we will come back to that in 1 or 2 weeks. For now, just be content with saying they kind of sort of look the same, which is good. because that's what you usually want. You usually want to see similar variances, and really the other thing you usually want is lower variances or lower variabilities, in this case measured by standard deviation. Okay, back to the slides. So I just gave you a mouthful about standard deviation. A very, very closely, almost identical measure is variance. And you'll notice, I put the question, does the formula look similar? Here's your standard deviation formula. Here's your variance formula. All you do basically is take away the square root. And then you have the variance formula. There should be, by the way, this is an error. This sigma should be over here next to the x, but it's not. I apologize. But if it were there, you would see the only difference between this guy and this guy is this square root. And that's it. Variance is simply standard deviation squared, or you could say conversely that standard deviation is the square root of variance because they're inverse operations. Okay, so which one do I use? Well, that's the next slide. I'm sorry, the next slide is how to figure out variance. Yeah, let's just do one quickly. It's very simple. It's the same thing as doing standard deviation. So let me do one quickly and I won't harp on it, but variance goes equal VAR. And then again, you have that choice between population and sample. So I'll just do population here. Open parentheses, drag whatever data you want to figure out the variance for, and close parentheses, and you got it. Okay, now it should be much bigger than the standard deviation because it's a squared term, right? So if I took the population variance and I squared that, let's just do it to the second power, you should get the number we just got, which is, yeah, there it is, 105. Just clean it up a little bit, and it's the same number. Okay, so it's relatively simple. It's the same process as standard deviation, and you see how to do it now in Excel. So back to slides. The slide I was itching to get to was this one, the last one, which is which one do I use? Again, 99% of the time, you're going to see standard deviation used. 1% of the time, it's going to be variance. We like standard deviation better because it's stated in original units. Because we're taking that square root of a square term, you get, so think about data is stated in terms of things, right? So it could be dollars, right? So why would you want to talk about the variation of your data in dollars squared? You wouldn't. You'd want to talk about variation in terms of dollars. That makes more sense. So we don't like variance a lot because of the fact that the terms get squared, where we want to talk in original units. So the interpretation is typically much easier when we use standard deviation, okay? Now, if you talk to business audiences and non-statistical audiences, standard deviation is the holy grail measure. Going to use it. When you start to use variance more is when you are doing, reports and journals for statisticians. Statisticians use variance more so than standard deviation for a lot of things. So you're not going to go there. You're going to go to the standard deviation measure most of the time, and we'll kind of leave it at that. Okay. I'm going to move on, do a little bit more. Actually, no, you know what? This is a good break. Who would be our next three contributors? Tell us. Yeah, so Jenna, I saw your hand. So why don't you tell us what you're thinking?
I was thinking about trying not to think about what's going on right now, but while I was reading about the labor market and wages, I really was thinking about how essential workers or even non-essential workers have become or have had to kind of adapt to the ever-changing times. So, I mean, for me and for my job, things changed like by the hour when this started happening, and I'm sure like probably everybody else too. But I was thinking about how what we feel are essential workers like nurses and doctors, public safety, but also even teachers. Like my kids' teachers had to adapt on, like us, we had to adapt on how we're going to take this class and how we're going to learn and how we're going to continue. But when it comes to, you know, the labor market and wages under unusual times, do things change because the demand becomes higher? No. You know, teachers, nurses, the demand is high. And I just read that like Governor Newsom is, you know, looking for help in the medical field, whether you're almost going to graduate or if you retired, you know, kind of wherever you can help, they're looking for that. But it's unfortunate that even when the demand becomes higher, I mean, we definitely value those workers, but we don't show it by paying them better wages. I mean, I'm looking at it from like the teaching standpoint, or the nurses that are putting themselves in, or, you know, medical care workers who are putting themselves in danger. But we really are, I mean, you know, their labor market has changed, but their wages kind of haven't. So it was something that I was thinking about, only because, you know, for the job market now, things are shifting and I'm a recruiter. So yeah.
No, it's a great point. Somebody tell us why that's not happening. Meaning, you know, think about a nurse on the front lines that's not getting a mask. They should be demanding more. You know, a lot of them don't because they're just humanitarians, and that's great. But what are some reasons why the laws of supply and demand are not obeyed like they should be, and then accord with everything that you just said? Why the discrepancy? Anybody? Don't all shout it out at once.
Well, some of it, I mean, unfortunately, we see this in the times of crisis, and too many people ignore it when it's not in times of crisis. And I don't know, it's pitiful that we don't see it, that we don't value our teachers, for instance, more during a regular thing. It's not till the parents have to take over that role that they think, oh, yeah, you know, these people may need to be paid a little bit more, but it's so easy when, you know, you're not having to deal, you yourself are not having to deal with the consequences of the teachers not being there. It's unfortunately that it takes something like that for the regular people to realize the value that should be placed on those careers.
Okay, so really what you're talking about here, if I frame it in economic terms, and that's a term we discussed earlier tonight, there's an information asymmetry going on here where, you know, one party knows what the value is, the other doesn't, because they don't haven't experienced it. So that's a great point. What else? There's a lot of reasons that can explain this discrepancy. That's a good one to start. What else?
It also have to do, Jordan, with the fact that we expect them to do that job. It's part of their job duties and in their descriptions. So from perspective point of view of a company or a hospital, I'm paying you to do that job. So why would I have to increase your salary?
Okay, well, so there's a couple things with that. One is, and you hit on the second point in a different way than I was thinking about it, but it's the same idea. One is, yeah, there's this thing called contracts, right? So contracts say you work at this wage for X amount of time, and maybe it gets renewed every month, maybe it's every year, but the point is contracts are sticky. They create sticky prices because they dictate what happens over a period of time. Now, you know, here's the thing. Let's talk about the nurses, right? And everything that's going on with the pandemic. So we need nurses more than ever before. We need doctors more than ever before. What's happening in some situations, not a lot, thankfully, is nurses are just quitting. Hi, not doing it. You're not giving me masks. You're making me work with COVID patients. I just not going to do it. Sorry. In some cases, you're not going to hear about it, but I'm sure there's a bunch of nurses who are saying, I want more. Pay me more. And maybe it's happening, maybe it's not. And maybe it's not happening because the hospital doesn't have the money or doesn't want to spend the money or thinks it can get away with not spending the money. Hospitals always seem to be bleeding cash for whatever reason. So theoretically, you know, when someone's services are needed more, they're in a position to dictate price. Okay, and again, why don't you do it? Because if you do that, then you get a bad rap. Because now it looks like you're being opportunistic, and you know, nurses are supposed to be humanitarian to start with, and it doesn't look good on them. So you know, there's social mores that keep prices sticky. There are contracts that keep prices sticky. There's information asymmetries that keep prices sticky, meaning they don't change in response to supply and demand. Any other thoughts? It's a really good question you asked, Jenna, because it's, again, you would think logic would dictate nurses should get more now, teachers should get more. I'm all for that, being a teacher, but I wouldn't ask for more because, again, I don't need more, and I don't think it's the right thing to do. But not everybody thinks that way. But anyway, any other?
Well,
yes.
I just wanted to speak from the perspective of living in France. Even waiters are part of a union. Every job has a value to the society. So it's, you know, it's a socialist country at heart. And so there's a larger middle class, and there's a social net that kind of creates this harmonious lifestyle. Everyone gets 5 weeks vacation. Everyone gets free childcare. Everyone gets money for the additional child that they bring into the world. So you get, you know, public housing. So you don't see people, if they're a doctor or a school teacher, you don't see these huge economic gaps in quality of life. So that's why people do sort of follow their humanitarian passions, whereas people choose to go into high-end, high-paying jobs, mainly because they pay well. But people who go into teaching, they go in because they know it's not going to pay well. It's going to be a struggle, but it's by passion. But you don't see that social net kind of catching people as it becomes harder to live. When you see changes in, say, price of gas or living, for example, housing. Housing is expensive everywhere, but just what I noticed is in France, there is a certain control that the government has to maintain a larger middle class. So.
Okay. So what you're saying is there are subsidies provided by the government or some other organization, but usually it's the government, that can kind of flatten out these spikes in demanding of price, basically, or so a socialistic net, basically.
Yeah, the overall cost of living. So a doctor in France is not a doctor in America.
Right.
A doctor in France is a little upper middle class. Doctor here in the United States, they're upper middle class, depending on specialty, depending on where they've done their residency, depending on what hospital they're associated with. It's, you know, it's I just found that in France, the educational system too is pretty across the board, just as good. So if you're in a poor North African, you know, neighborhood, it's just as good as the best neighborhood in Paris. Yeah. So your chances of being able to go to good schools are, you know, there isn't that gap, that achievement gap that we see here in the United States, starting with that. So that's you know, when we talk on, you know, capitalism versus socialism and kind of jobs we choose for whatever reasons, it's there's, I don't know, I just noticed that people there all seem to go on vacation for 3 weeks. I'm like, in America, no one goes on vacation for 1 week. You know, it's like we have a very different concept of the reason why we are who we are. We're not existential in our thinking. We don't take the time to navel gaze like that. We work, you know.
That may change, you know. I was thinking if Bernie Sanders had gotten, well, I think he's out, but, you know, assuming he would have gotten it, I think you might have started to see some changes, especially with medicine. But also in France, I'll throw in, since you brought up the France topic, it's very hard to get fired, I understand, right? Because you have to really screw up, because there's that social safety net there that France has that we don't have here. And, you know, there's pros and cons to that, but the pro obviously is that you don't see opportunistic price gouging kinds of things.
Well, and also people work 35-hour weeks there. And people do job shares.
Yes.
You know, so but they have higher unemployment too, so there's the downside.
Right. Right, higher unemployment, but taxes are higher. You know, it's basically in France. There's not as much pressure to earn a living. Not that there's zero. It's just it's here in America, capitalist society, you work or you starve. That's it, basically. So anyway, really cool topic. Let's keep moving on. Great answers. Who else has a thought to contribute? I want to get to all 9 of you tonight. Adriana, Laura.
I'll go.
All right.
I have something to contribute.
Go ahead.
Me? Oh, okay. When I was reading the chapter on antitrust and competition, my thought was on monopoly and how PG&E is, to me, is still considered a monopoly. I know they mentioned on the fact that water and garbage are kind of like monopolies, but they're not considered monopolies because each city has its own water and garbage section. But I'm just wondering why, if they considered the fact of dissecting Microsoft and making it into breaking them out, why is PG&E not broken out, like just electricity and just gas? So.
Oh, you're asking why isn't the government separated them into 2 separate companies, one gas, one electric?
Yes. I mean, even with the bankruptcy issues, what did the bankruptcy issues do? What happens to PG&E? Just all the fires that went out, I didn't see that it affected them in any way, and maybe it's because they are considered a monopoly.
Right. And so companies like PG&E are what are called natural monopolies because it's very hard to run them in any other way. Not that it's impossible, and we have other alternatives. You can buy energy off the solar grid, but even PG&E winds up managing that because they're such a behemoth. But anybody have a thought? Why would Gavin Newsom and company decide not to break PG&E up into gas and electric separately? Which appears is what they're doing, or they're not doing. Why would you not do that? Well,
isn't there a cost associated with it? Oh, sorry.
No, go. I want you to speak. Go ahead.
Isn't there a cost associated with it? Because you would have to make a lot of changes, huge changes to their infrastructure and how everything is run and done. So you would probably have to start from scratch, essentially, because of the way the corporation's already in a hole. And you would have to repair everything or redo everything that's needed for both things, electricity and gas.
Right. Perfect. So there's probably, and again, none of us are experts in this probably, but think about your bill, right? You get your bill every month and there's the gas part, the electric part. So something as simple as how you bill people now, people are going to get 2 bills instead of 1. And who the hell wants that? Nobody. You want everything on one. I mean, the statements are complicated enough as it is. You ever read your electric bill? It's crazy. So, take that problem, then multiply it by 100 other things that now you're kind of separating. And logistically, it probably doesn't make sense to separate the 2 because of like you said, the infrastructure. Okay. So what you do instead, which is what Gavin Newsom has been trying to do, is you let them run as one company, but you subject them to a lot of constraints and threats. And, if you don't do this, we're going to shut you down or we're going to sell you to somebody else. So they're going through all these different machinations of how to deal with PG&E. But the basic idea with PG&E is they don't know how to self-manage. They're the worst utility company probably in the country. And the major failing with them is, of course, they didn't replace the grid. They didn't replace they had 10 years, they knew about this. Fires are not new. I'm going off on a little tangent here, but quickly. Fires are not new. We've had fires since California existed. They're getting worse and worse because of climate change and because we're building in areas we shouldn't. But we've known about this for at least the last decade. It's become more of a problem every year. And they sat back and did nothing. They didn't replace the infrastructure. And so now it's going to take 10 years to replace the infrastructure, and they're just starting on it now because of the last 3 years were a disaster. So anyway, yeah, you will only see more rather than less regulation of PG&E over time, but it will not amount to, at least in my opinion, splitting them into gas and electric. It wouldn't make sense logistically. Great idea. Great question. Who's our number 3?
I want to add Mountain House. We get Modesto Irrigation for electricity and PG&E for gas, so we get 2 separate bills for our utilities. But that's it. That's all I can say about
Okay.
that.
But you're probably making out better, right? Because it would be you don't know. Okay. But yeah, all right. So one more piece of mail to add to your list. All right. Third contribution. Who's up? All right, Tina. Great.
I was just thinking about from the supply and demand perspective, we were talking about last week how the firms usually decide what to produce based on the needs that they see in society. And we talked about
Uh-oh. She disappeared. All right. Who wants to go? And she'll come back probably in a second. Who's our substitute? Nobody? Okay. We'll let Tina talk when she comes back. I'm going to go back to the material. I'm going to do the next unit in stats, since we were on a stats roll just a second ago. So let me get to a share. The next topic in statistics is visualization. That's actually the new word that we're using. It's not in the slides. Visualization, illustration of data. Why do we do it? How do we do it best? What are some principles? But the basic concept is if you can illustrate data, it's probably going to be more useful than just giving you the numbers. Who wants to stare at a bunch of numbers? Almost nobody. Think about, when you are driving and you see a stop sign, do you look at the letters STOP? No, what you do is you look at the sign, it's that hexagonal shape or whatever it is, and it's red and it's got white, and before you even read it, you don't even read it, that it's a stop sign. So it's the same thing with visualization of data. Is we want to put it into a pictographic format so that it's more easily interpreted and more quickly interpreted. And bullet point 2, it tells a story. Data, if it's organized in the right way, should tell some kind of a story, and that's what we're after. What is the story behind what is going on with the data, okay? And then the last point I just mentioned with the stop sign, we're more responsive to graphics than to text, and that's why we do it. So this is a double entendre here, 10 ways to a great figure, but here the figure is not your body, it's your, how do we make a nice graph or a nice chart? And the key principle that pervades everything here is more is less. Get out whatever doesn't need to be there, get it out of the picture. And oh, by the way, what we tend to see in reality is the exact opposite. For some reason, people want to put more and more stuff, more and more into figures when they should be going in the opposite direction. So number 1, minimize the junk, things that I don't need to know. 2 is hard to do, but theoretically you should try to figure out what story do I want to tell? What do I absolutely need to show? What is junk? So that's planned before you start creating. But then, of course, when you're in the middle of it, you can move it around and alternate ideas and see what works best, and that's fine. 3, okay, that's okay. Say what you mean what you say, whatever. That's true of everything, I think, not just graphs. Label everything to the extent that it doesn't clutter your graph. Sometimes the good decision is not to label something because it's just taking up too much space and cluttering things. But to the extent that you can label because it makes things clearer. Try to tell one story, one idea in a simple graph or pictographic representation. Now, that doesn't mean that there's only one thing going on. It's just that when you're trying to tell a story and you're trying to tell 6 stories at the same time, you're going to start to lose people's attention. So the best thing to do, again, keep it simple, one idea, and the organization should support that idea. 5 and 6 go together, keep things balanced. It kind of fits with the one idea notion. And then also just the way you show things should be balanced. Maintaining scale, this, you hear the phrase lies, damn lies, statistics. One of the ways statisticians manipulate things is they change scales and graphs. So if something small looks big, something big looks small, and everything in between. And what we're telling you is don't do that because it's dishonest and misleading. So use the scale that should be there, and don't crunch scales, don't over exaggerate them. 8 is more of the same. Simple is best, less is more. Limit number of words, same idea. And then you should be able to know what's going on just by looking at the chart. But the way data displays work is we have a chart and then we have verbiage, whether the verbiage is written or oral. So the verbiage is the luxury. The absolute necessity is the chart, and I should be able to substitute the chart for the verbiage if I need to. Okay, so what you're going to see most of the time, if you're looking at statistical studies and journals and just regular old business reports, is frequency distributions, which is just a way of tallying how many times something occurs, a score occurs. And typically we will wind up not looking at every single score, but rather ranges of scores. So here's a good example. I don't know what this data is of, it doesn't matter, but the point is, whatever the data is, if we look at how many scores occurred in the 45 to 49 range, there was just 1. If we look at how many scores occurred in the 40 to 44 range, it was 2. Your modal range is here, it's bimodal. This category, 25 to 29 and 20 to 24, have the highest number of occurrences. Okay, so this is, again, typically you're going to see ranges because I don't want to list out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 49. That would take up too much space. And we don't need to know at that level anyway what's going on with the data, so we do these class intervals. I can then take this data and plot it as a histogram. That's the most commonly occurring statistical representation graphically, is the histogram. So how do you do a histogram? Well, you go, on the x-axis are your class intervals, on the y-axis are your frequencies, and then you just draw bars representing the frequencies for each of the class intervals. Okay, so it's hard to see here in the drawing, but this is 0 to 4 class interval, this is 5 to 9, this is 10 to 14, and so on and so forth. What do we say? The 20 to 24 and 25 to 29 had the highest frequencies. They were the bimodal ranges. So that's shown here by having the biggest bars, the tallest bars at just right at 10, actually. It should be exactly 10 if we go back to the data. I don't know why it seems to show. Actually, whatever, it doesn't matter. 10 or near 10. It's close enough. Okay, so, again, I look at this graph. What do? I can see right away that the most data is here in the middle. It's very little on the side here, very little on the side here, and that's good because I'm getting a very quick lay of the land overview of what's going on with the data, and the story it's telling is most of your scores are occurring here in the middle, okay? Then I can do this thing called a frequency polygon, which just connects the midpoints of all these bars. So it's the same thing as a histogram, except now turning it into a line, which approximates the shape of the bars. So why would I want to do that? Well, because I cannot use the bars to do mathematic manipulation. This is nice to look at, but it's not mathematically sound. This graph here of this polygon, called the frequency polygon, is a mathematical entity, which means it has a functional form, which means you can say f of x equals something with an x, and then you can do a lot more with that than you can do with this guy. Okay, so it evolves down into being mathematically useful. Let's keep it at that, and then move on to this slide, which is the cumulative frequency distribution. What you're doing is you're taking this line and then doing what's called a cumulative sum. So what was the frequency between 0 and 4? Well, it was 1. What was the frequency between 5 and 9? It was 2. So when I go to the 5 and 9 here, it actually is going to add the 1 plus the 2 to arrive at 3. If you were to trace this over, it would be right at 3. So you're continuously adding each of these frequencies to the last one. So it would be 1 plus 2 is 3, 3 plus 4 is 7, 7 plus 8 is 15, and so on and so forth. And this line has nowhere to go but up. It has to keep going up because you keep adding positive frequencies to the last class interval that you had. Okay? You're never going to use this. I just want you to know it's out there. There are statistical uses for this. Let's leave it at that and move on. Okay, so if we have a distribution, again, what's a distribution? It's this. Whether you want to talk about it in bars or you want to talk about it in lines, statisticians like lines better because of what I said before. But distributions can have these 4 characteristics. This one we already talked about with standard deviation. So we're going to look at the other 3 characteristics. Again, data has a personality. We're describing the personality of the data using these characteristics. So the first is average value. You know what an average is by now. You always knew. And the way it's shown graphically is here are all the possible average values for there's 3 different data distributions here. Look at the 3 curves. And you can see quite easily that the average for B is higher than the average for A. The average for C is higher than averages for B and A, okay? So that one, there's not much to say other than averages can be ranked on a continuum. The more interesting one is the one we discussed before, variability. We talked about it in terms of the measure, standard deviation or variance, or even range. What we didn't do is show it graphically. When you show 3 different data sets or distributions graphically and try to compare their variability, here's what happens. The one that is the least variable is distribution A. Okay, because what this tight curve around the average is saying is that the values are clustering closely into that average. So that's like the 444 data set we talked about before, but it's not 444, it's something else. But the points are close to each other. So you see this nice kind of almost like popsicle going right over the average line here. If I go to distribution C, that's the most variable because it just tends to flatten out over a greater amount of space, okay? So what does that mean? We have some data here, we have some here, we have some here, here, all the way out to here, and that's going to be your highest standard deviation data set. B is right in the middle of the 2, so it's going to be a moderate variation or variability or standard deviation. Okay, but again, you can eyeball this, but at the end of the day, this is just for getting a basic understanding of how your data sets are looking, and then you're going to actually calculate values with Excel or your stats package. Now, skewness. This is a very important concept in statistics. It's one that absolutely drives me bonkers because whoever came up with this naming system didn't know what they were doing. They really should have done the opposite of what they're doing, and I'll try not to confuse you. But you have what are called positively, negatively skewed data sets, also called right skewed and left skewed. What's going on here, let's take a look at distribution B. That's the kind of the regular one where there's no skew going on because you have data, pretty much the same amount of data all throughout the distribution. Okay, even though it's starting to be less in the tails to the left and right, the vast majority of your data is occurring here to here, and that's covering a wide range. So there's nothing skewed. If you want to think about a quick example of skewness is, well, let's look at gender in our class, right? We have, what is it? If we include me, I think there's 2 or 3 males in the class and there's 7 or 8 females, okay? So this is a way gender skewed class because we have, the mode is female by a wide margin, and then males, there's only 2 of us. So that's a skewed data set. But if we had 50% female, 50% male, then it would be like curve B, no skewness. Okay, so it's trying to tell you, skewness is trying to tell you what direction does the bulk of the data head in. And so let's look at distribution A. I'm going to trace the curve here. You have a lot of data going on here, but it turns out that the bulk of your data actually occurs in this flattening out or flatter, lower slope part of the curve. Because you have some data here, some here, some here, some here, some here, less and less as I go further out. So this is what we call a tail. This thing, think about a mouse with a tail, right? It's the thing that kind of hangs out, right? So this is hanging out on the right side. So we call this right skewed, or because we're going up on the axis, the x-axis to see the tail, it's called positive skewed, because this is more and more here is more positive, okay? So a positive skewed or a right skewed curve, you're seeing a disproportionate amount of data to the right. Whereas with a negatively skewed or a left skewed curve, it's the opposite. The tail is over here on the left, so you're seeing more and more data happen in this tail than you are seeing in this portion of the curve, okay? So it's literally telling you, is the data skewed low? Is it skewed high? Is it all uniform? And we can compute it. It's literally a number like variation was, like standard deviation was. And look at the formula. Basically, the action is in this top part of the equation, mean minus median. Where the mean falls versus where the median falls is going to tell you how much skew you have, the comparison of the two. Now, it just so happens we multiply it by 3 and we divide by the standard deviation, but that's a mathematical formality. The action is in the difference between mean and median, okay? If the mean is exactly on the same spot as the median, then you have no skewness, and that is what is going on in curve B. Mean and median are the same, okay? What's going to happen in curve C and curve A is that the mean is going to get pulled in the direction of where more data is. Okay, so if more data is over here, then you're going to see mean here. If more data is over here, in this curve, you're going to see the mean get pulled in that direction. And so that's conceptually how the skewness number gets calculated. And the bigger the difference between mean and median, the higher the skewness you have, because this difference determines everything. So it turns out to do this on Excel is pretty simple. Let me just kind of talk about it a little bit more qualitatively, because there's 3 terms that, no, sorry, that's kurtosis. I'm stealing forward here. So let's actually go ahead and do the Excel. The Excel function, you're going to look at this rule to tell you what kind of a skewness you have. So I'm going to copy this onto Excel, and I'm going to bring back up our spreadsheet, go to chapter 4, and let's go ahead and just copy what we said here. So we have the rule in front of us. Now, what I did is I created 3 data sets, one that has positive skew, one with 0 skew, and one with a negative skew. Notice you can substitute the word right or left skew for positive and negative. So the function on Excel is pretty easy. You do equals skew, and it looks like you can do it for population, or I guess skew without a P would be the sample. I'm just going to do skew, keep it simple. And then put in your data. This is like the easiest function on Excel to do. All you need is one parameter. And I'm going to drag it out so it does skews for the other data sets. And look what we got. We got 0 skew here in the center. We got negative skew here on the left skew data. And we got positive skew here on the right skew data. So let's look at each of these. Okay, so again, the rule is if it's a 0 answer, there's no skew. Okay, that's easy. If it's greater than 0, in this case, it's positive or right skewed. If it's negative, it's this case, negative skewed or left skewed. Okay, but let's look at the data. What's going on in this right skew data set? Where is my tail? My tail actually is here. Okay, because I'm seeing a little bit of data in the 2. It's a couple of 2s. It's 1, 3. It's 1, 4, 1, 5. So think again about, I'm not going to go back to the slide, where you're seeing lower frequency, but a lot of lower frequencies, and that's your tail. It's a right side tail, and that's why it's called right skew. On this data set, it's the opposite. I rigged it that way, where your high frequencies are here in the 4s and the 5s, but then when you go to the left here, you're seeing a tail composed of the 1, 2, and the 3, and maybe a little bit of the 4. Okay, so that low frequency data, but a lot of the different data points is happening closer to the 0 point on the x-axis or on the left side. All right, it drives me crazy because it's hard to think in terms of those terms. But the way to think about it is, again, look for the tail. If the tail is to the right, it's right skewed or positive skewed. If the tail is to the left, it's left skewed or negative skewed. And if it's just a symmetrical distribution, then you have no skewness, basically. Okay, back to the next concept, kurtosis. I was starting to get into that a little prematurely, but kurtosis talks about the peakedness. The word peak, you have, think about, you get an injection, right? That's a very peak curve. It's basically a needle, right? And the needle here is distribution C, okay? But then you start to flatten out in distribution B, and the peak gets less, and then you have almost no peak here in distribution A. So what's happening as you go from C to B to A is you're seeing a decrease in kurtosis. And then we have terms to describe the heavy peak, the light peak, and then everything in between. When you have the strong peak, it's called leptokurtic, so that's C, that's your needle. When you have the opposite, where it's a very gradual flattening out, that's called platykurtic, and the word plat means flat in Latin. So this is your platykurtic curve. And then no kurtosis, that's just called no kurtosis, is when you have a symmetrical, I'm sorry, not a symmetrical distribution, but basically in between the three cases where this one is, it's kind of peaked, but not so much. This is more peaked, this is less peaked, this is in between, so there's no kurtosis. Now, formula-wise, there's always a formula, there's always an Excel function. This is your formula. What it does is where's the action in this guy? It's the x minus the x bar, which is very, very similar to what we use to figure out standard deviation. So standard deviation and kurtosis kind of sort of move in the same direction. That is to say, if you have, I'm sorry, they move in opposite directions. If you have a high variation, no, I take that back. If you have high standard deviation, you'll probably wind up having a high kurtosis. Don't quote me on that. I actually have to go back and investigate. There is a relationship, is what I'm saying, between the two, and I have to think about more. I think it's the former thing of what I said. But don't even worry about that. We're just going to have Excel calculate it, and the action is between all the data points and the relationship in distance to the mean. And the rest of this is just mathematical convenience to get the number looking good. So this is the rule. If we get a kurtosis of 3, there's no kurtosis. It's a normal curve. If it's greater than 3, it's leptokurtic. If it's less than 3, it's platykurtic. So let's copy that rule into Excel and then do the calculations. So back to screen 2, okay. And I'm going to copy that here. And notice we have again, I rigged it, platykurtic, a normal, which is no kurtosis, and a leptokurtic. And the function is simply equals curt, open parentheses, and I'm going to drag this data set. And then I'm going to do kurtosis for the other two just by dragging. And let's clean these numbers up a little bit because I don't like dealing in too many decimals. But here you go. We have a 1.3 kurtosis negative. And so kurtosis, by the way, can be negative. But certainly if it's negative, it's less than 3. So that means we have a platykurtic curve here, which means it's very spread out. Not a needle, basically just a very nice, that's kind of like Kansas, right? Very, very flat. Here we have a kurtosis of a little bit more than 3. It's like 3.6, okay? So I couldn't, when I was doing this, I had to create all these data sets and I couldn't get it exactly 3. It would take me a million years to do that. So after a certain while, I just gave up and I said, okay, this is close enough. So yeah, it's, you can be approximate. 3.6 is about 3, and that's normal, no kurtosis or slight kurtosis. But then you have this case over here where you're definitely leptokurtic because it's much greater than 3, okay? So what does that mean again? It goes back to the pictures that we showed you of how the curves look in terms of how peaked they are. And that's the basic idea. All right, finishing up. Let me go back to the slides, and then we're almost done with the topics tonight, but I want to just talk quickly about bar graphs on Excel are very, very easy. I probably am insulting your intelligence by even showing you how to do it, but you have so many options. You can have bar graphs, you can have line graphs, you can have pie charts. The one that you can't necessarily have, and this boggles my mind. I don't know what the Excel folks were thinking. Probably this is their way to make more money, but you can't actually do histograms on Excel unless you have what's called the data analysis tool pack, okay, which means it's like an add-in, and I'll show you how to do that later on in the course. Some people have it, some people don't, but if you don't have it, you can't do histograms, which again, it's crazy because it's like the most common thing that statisticians do. But let me show you what you can do very quickly, and it's, you know, it's great. I mean, Excel is, to me, the most flexible display tool in the world. So I'm going to use this data set here, the political affiliation, and I'm going to tell Excel, I'm going to the Insert tab and telling Excel that I want, first I'm going to do is highlight this stuff, and I'm going to tell Excel I want a chart. Okay, so let's say I just want a bar chart, and there's, you know, there's options, you can make it look however you want, but let's just pick the simple one, and it's putting it somewhere, but I can't seem to find it. All right, there we go. Oh, why is it not coming up? All right, let me undo that, redo it. I said it was simple, and then it's not showing, right? So you should be, by the way, you should be able to copy the, and maybe that's the problem. In this case, no, let me try copying the title as well as the data. That should still, most of the time, produce the chart. Insert, and where is my bar chart? Yeah, there it is. Okay, so, you know, in a nanosecond it comes up, and I can change it. I can do different kinds of iterations of that with the numbers, without them. Let's say I want a pie chart. You know, same deal. Highlight your data, go to Insert, look at the pie chart, and you have a couple of options there. But it's so easy, and you've probably done it before. So I'll leave it at that. Just know that the one thing you can't do without the data analysis tool pack is histograms. Okay. All right. So that's all I want to say there. Let's hear from our studio audience again. So Tina, did you come back? Sorry, was it Tina? Sorry, yeah, it was Tina, right?
Me, sorry, computer died.
Yes.
Right when I started talking.
No problem.
I was just gonna say, I was just thinking about like consumer behavior in general. Like I know we talked about suppliers kind of produce what's being demanded, and especially like as it relates to like the fashion industry and the clothing industry, I feel like we consume a lot of things that we don't necessarily need, and we're just constantly buying because they're selling it. And I just don't understand where the cycle really ends. It's like, do we buy it because they're selling it, or are they selling it because we want it? It's just that whole relationship of like the supplier and the consumer relationship of just creating, I don't want to, well, I guess it is like unnecessary products sometimes, especially with the fast fashion industry, because we buy it and then it gets thrown out to the trash, and then it goes to the landfills, and it's just creating more issues.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just that whole cycle of like buying, throwing away, and just unnecessary cycle. Where does it end, really? That's what I was thinking about as we were talking about this topic last week.
Okay, great question. What do you guys think? Think about your own behavior. What do you guys do?
Yeah, I feel like we're all guilty of it. It's just they advertise and we're like, oh, I need that. And then we just go get it. And we probably wear it one time, and, and then we don't even know what happens to it after that. So.
Well, I'll say this, and again, you guys chime in as thoughts occur, but the economists on this particular question are kind of have a stupid viewpoint, which is that supply and demand are separate. They don't affect each other. So in other words, when a company just sells something, it shouldn't change your willingness to buy it. And that's just not true, because of things like you said, advertising plays a role. nowadays social media matters.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think the biggest one tends to be, this is what I study a lot in my research, is, when your friends buy something, your family buys it, you have to buy it too. Okay. Just think about the Christmas lights phenomenon. Your neighbor does it, you do it too. But it can extend to any purchase. So a lot of it is, there is a big relationship between supply and demand. Buying begets more buying. There's this thing called buying inertia, which says if you get into modes of activity, so you start buying things, whether it's online or in the store, and because you're doing it all the time, it makes you more likely to buy even more. Okay. And that, as you said, can be very dangerous because that's how you make yourself poor and bankrupt. Is you start buying, you keep
Practically.
buying, and then you're out of luck. So. But the psychology at play here is once you start buying, it makes it more likely you're going to buy other things. So I see this in myself all the time. I started, with the pandemic, I started ordering online. At first it was essentials. Like I got some cans of chili because I figured if there's total Armageddon, I want to have some chili because I'm not giving up my meat consumption. But then it was like, okay, no, look, and Amazon, obviously they don't help. They start showing you ads for things when you're on your computer and you didn't close out of the browser. So they show me a little foot massager. I'm like, okay, well, if I'm going to be at my desk 24 hours a day, now I got to order this foot massager, and I got it right. You don't see it. It's under my desk. So that's what's happening. My buying is begetting more buying, and as you go further and further into the future, the buying becomes less need-based and more want-based, and so again, that's another factor. It's called buying inertia. So you have peers, you have buying inertia, you have advertising and other enticements, and then you just have the desire to consume. People they feel better. Retail therapy, they feel better when they're buying things. Now, never mind the debt hangover and the debt crunch and all that happens later, but when you're in the store, God, does it feel good to buy a lot of the time. And the more you buy, the better you feel, and who doesn't want to feel good, right? So anyway, that's my quick explanation. What else do you guys think on that? Because it's a really great question.
I have an opinion on this. I think it, even for me, it has a lot to do with access. And when I was a kid, I didn't have access to buy something online and have it shipped to me or be here in 2 days, or if I saw fast fashion and it was cheap, I'll buy it. I feel like we didn't have that when we were growing up. We had to beg our parents to take us to the store or the mall, or if, whatever. My mom was at Target, I had to beg her to buy me a shirt, but now kids who are, I don't know, my kid's 5 and he knows how to order something off of Amazon. So I think it's access. It comes down to education, even when it comes to when my parents were immigrants and they didn't teach me about money, and when you get a credit card, you have to pay it off on time. You shouldn't hold a balance. So I think it comes down to culture has changed, access has changed, the way, generational changes, times have changed. Little kids, they don't want to play with chalk on the sidewalk anymore. They want a $500 iPad because that's what everyone else has.
Right.
So yeah, that's just my opinion on that.
No, that's a great input. And I want to pick up on one thing that you said, culture, because I studied this and I find it very interesting. I'll just use one culture as an example, the Indian culture, people who live in India versus here in America. Kids buy things earlier and to a greater extent, or they nag their parents because most kids don't have money, obviously, when they're young. That's a much more of an American phenomenon than it is in India. In India, kids don't start buying things or even being interested in products or nagging their parents to purchase them until they're, say, 3 to 4 years older than American kids. So there's a cultural schism there, or duality. And then you can look at other cultures, but the Indian culture is the one that remember from the research, where the onset of purchasing patterns happens later in life, because that's the culture. That's the way that the kids are raised in that country. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know, but I know there's a difference. So great, really good contribution. Let's keep going on so that we get to bed on time. Who else do we have left? I think 2 or 3 of you.
Yeah, Jordan. Actually, I have a question regarding the real estate. I heard recently the government increased the loan interest rate and make it 5%. Can we consider this increase as a price floor, and how it affects the real estate market?
Which interest rate went to 5%?
Yeah, it's a loan to interest percent rate.
Okay, so the problem is, though, there's so many.
It's a mortgage, right?
Mortgage loans, yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is a complicated issue, and it's funny you mention it because I'm trying to get a refi in my own house, and it's a total disaster. And so
yeah, me too.
Me too. Okay. So what happened was 5 weeks ago, before the pandemic really took hold, I had a nice offer to lower my interest rate by a percentage point. Now it's basically the same as what I'm paying before, and the reason it's happening is because, first of all, it shouldn't keep happening. You should keep checking. But the reason it's happened over the last few weeks that interest rates didn't go down, they went up for homes, mortgages, is because there was a lack of liquidity in the mortgage loan market. So we're going to get into this when we talk about macroeconomics. But basically, the government did not make it easy for lenders to lend. Basically the way the government does that is it injects liquidity into the market by buying treasury securities, okay? So we'll get to that later in the course, but essentially it took the government a while to respond to this. And initially also what happened was when the pandemic took hold, people had this reflex reaction of applying for mortgages. They wanted more refis because they thought rates were going to go down. So the rates didn't go down, the applications went up because everybody's trying to take advantage. So that pushed rates even higher. Supply and demand at work right there, okay? So yeah, basically it's a higher demand, lower supply of loanable funds pushing the interest rate up for houses.
But we see a lot of people want to sell their house now. And on the other side, there is a lot of buyer.
No, I don't think so. I think what's happening mostly, what I'm seeing, and again, this could change depending on how bad the situation gets. If your house is dropping in value, you don't want to sell, you want to wait it out. Okay, so I think that's, so one thing is I've heard a talk of a freeze in prices. And so in other words, if your house is selling for $700,000 in the Bay Area, it's going to take a few months for this thing to clear up. And then when it does, the price will resume at $700,000, just to use a quick example. The force against people buying is you look at your portfolio, it used to be worth $1 million, now it's worth half that if you're lucky. So why the hell would I want to buy now unless prices are really, really dropping, which they're not. They're frozen because homes are being taken off the market because sellers don't want to sell into a declining market. So I think that's mostly what's happening. I expected the opposite. I thought, I'm trying to buy a vacation home, so I'm trying to buy in Oregon. I thought the prices would plummet, and they're going down, but not a lot.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I'm not buying. Yeah. Great point. All right,
Thank you.
who else? Thank you.
I can go.
Go ahead, Ariana.
Okay, so I know that last week we were talking about how the prices are determined by the market and not the producers, and we also talked about how self-interest is a way to organize society, and we're talking a little bit about supply and demand. But I guess is there an etiology to how the prices were determined by the market before? Like what's the etiology behind that?
Etiology meaning the cause.
How did they determine the very first prices, or how did they even conclude? How did they get to that point to where we are now? Where did it all kind of start off?
Okay, so I think you're asking about, let's say we go back to the year 2007 and Apple is launching the iPhone, right? That kind of a situation where nothing has been sold before like this?
Yeah, kind of like that.
So that's a $1 million question, and there's a lot of answers you can give there. But one quick one is, you put out a price that you think is the best one, and you see what happens, and then you adjust. Okay, but how do you come up with that first best one? Well, you relate it back to other kinds of things like, what did flip phones sell for? Which is a bad comparison because obviously iPhones or smartphones are much more complicated than that, and they have more features. But you use some combination of trying to compare what you're selling anew to what is sold before, what's the closest substitute, and then you make adjustments. And then also, look, the iPhone cost Apple, I don't know, $300 to make. I don't know what the magic number is. Let's just say 300. That's going to set your floor on what pricing. Your pricing can't go below that. So part of it is just literally the cost. Okay. But yeah, these are very difficult decisions. What I've seen in corporate practice is you can actually do survey research and focus group research that will tell you what price will likely maximize profit. And it has a lot to do with what that elasticity coefficient is. Once you know the elasticity, which you get through survey data, you can use that directly to set price. So that's, it's not a complete answer, but it's a start answer. Anybody have a different thought? How do you set price when you haven't set price before?
I have not a different thought, but just to add on to that, I feel like it just depends on the cost of the product to begin with and the market study, like you said. So that's where the price level is going to start. Like if it costs Apple $300 to make the product, then they kind of calculate what they want the profit margin to be like, and they kind of throw it out there, like you said. And if the market responds to it and buys whatever it is that's selling because they want it, then they're like, oh, this is a good price point. And then they just keep adding something to it and increasing the price, and they kind of set the price for themselves. And if you're using Apple as an example too, like we talked about last week, they kind of just, it's not that they're listening to the consumer. They kind of just give us what they think we want because they just assume we don't know what we want. And it's like we kind of just get what they give us because we feel like they know what's best for us. So I guess usually it's just the point of you start with the cost of the product that you're producing, and then you kind of calculate your own profit margin and adjust the price from there. Perfect.
I think that's what, again, in the majority of cases, that's what you're doing. You're combining cost data with elasticity, what's called sensitivity data, and using elasticity. But it's never easy. It's never easy. Okay. Did we leave anybody out? We get everybody?
No. Okay. Anyone else? Donna, did you go?
Donna went before.
Okay. Well, I think I'm the last one. I was really interested in the conversation about deregulation and just the benefits of deregulation, like the airline industry, what it did for the consumer in the sense that it dropped prices. I mean, maybe not better service, but also the deregulation of Ma Bell, these major mega organizations and companies, and deregulation actually worked out for the consumer in the end, like the banking industry too. And, and part of it was the adaptation to the times. We have our cell phones now. We can do banking on our phone. We don't have to go to an ATM. It's sort of like it could have happened naturally too. So I thought that was a nice little read on companies that have had to face breaking down their monopoly, let's say, and then also adapting to the consumer market. So there is this sort of tension between government interference, let's say, and then the natural hand of the consumer, the great American consumer that we all are now. So so I thought that was just a very interesting, so like a juxtapose of concepts.
Yes, great observation. The thing about deregulation is it's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, like you said, the whole point of it is to bring prices down to consumers, to increase that consumer surplus. to put it in last week's terms. The problem with deregulation is you look at an airline, an industry like the airlines, a lot of these airlines can't survive, right? So yes, you might be dropping prices for consumers, and then sometimes you buy these plane tickets, you go, what? No, I don't think so, right? If you buy a plane ticket 3 days before you want to fly, you're paying $2,000 to fly to frickin' LA. It's like ridiculous. So number one, deregulation doesn't always work. Number two, it doesn't help. I mean, if you're an airline, you hate it because the surplus is extracted away from you and put in favor of the consumer. And so it's harder for you to survive and airlines is an extreme example of that. Airlines go in and out all the time of business because of the deregulation. Before the deregulation, think about like Pan Am, they were there forever. All these big airlines, some of which survived today, but others of which didn't, they just had a steady state for the longest time because the government was basically helping them. And then the other thing that happens is because the airlines go in and out of business, the government winds up subsidizing them in times of crises like, now. And then back in 9/11 happened, and then a few other times, the government is just sending them millions of dollars. And that's not necessarily a good thing either because, that's money that could be used for other purposes, but they choose to keep the airlines afloat when a lot of them probably shouldn't be. So anyway, deregulation is a tricky concept. We're going to talk more about it probably next week when we get into monopolies and cartels and all that. But it's not always a good thing, especially from the company's perspective. If you care about that, as consumers, we obviously care about ourselves as consumers. But if you're working for the airline, you don't like it, right? Because that's probably your job that you're going to lose when they deregulate. So,
I think of like JetBlue, I think of Virgin Airlines, Southwest. I mean, you can hop around the country pretty much, and you can kind of negotiate those prices, and it's like, and what service you like best, and what you're looking for. This sort of event in your life, which is traveling, for the most part, is miserable. But we're a large country, and we're an aviation country. People just don't realize it. So.
Yes, now there's flight shaming. We're reversing on that because of Greta, right? Greta's telling us not to fly, or whoever, any environmental.
Yeah, Greta.
So we'll see. Well, look, with the pandemic combined with the environmental concerns, I don't know about the future of flight, but I think it's probably going to stick around. Maybe not as much as it used to. Okay. Well, it's way past our bedtime, so I don't want to interfere with that. Let's just go over quickly what you can do for next week. I'm going to kind of go back to the syllabus, if I can find the damn thing somewhere on my screens. All right, so I think that's it. So we are now here. We have gone through everything in week 1. We covered elasticity, market structures, the perfect competition segment of that. We did data presentation methods. We didn't quite get into normal curves. So when we look at, let me go to the Moodle. You should be able to do, you're seeing my Moodle, right? Okay. For microeconomics, economic mindset, supply and demand, elasticity, we're caught up there. The first, this one we did too, market structure. So the first 4 under microeconomics, and then under stats, everything through data presentation methods. You are now fully equipped to do for next week. But again, no hard, fast rule. You do it at your own convenience, but I suggest doing it as close to time as possible to when we talked about it in class. So any questions, any concluding thoughts for next time?
No.
All right, I'm glad you're still awake. That's a positive sign. Hopefully you're enjoying everything, and we'll see you next time at 6 o'clock. Thanks.
Thank you. Good night.
Take care.